What if everything we were taught was incomplete? Hidden in plain sight, scattered across ancient ruins, classified archives, and forgotten manuscripts. There are gaps, deliberate gaps, moments in human history where the official record goes eerily quiet, and the deeper you look, the more questions multiply. Who built it? Where did they go? How did they know? 3 hours, dozens of cases, each one more baffling than the last, and not a single clean answer in sight. Buckle up. This rabbit hole goes deeper than you think. The Tower of London stands on the north bank of the Thames like a stone confession, ancient, immovable, and full of things it refuses to say. Tourists walk its cobbled grounds today, photographing ravens and beefeater guards, largely unaware that somewhere beneath the weight of its history lies one of the most haunting unsolved cases the medieval world ever produced. 2 boys, a throne, and then silence. In the summer of 1483, 12-year-old Edward V and his 10-year-old brother Richard, Duke of York, were housed within the tower's walls under the guardianship of their uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. On paper, it was a protective arrangement. Edward had recently been declared king following the death of his father, Edward IV. But before his coronation could take place, everything changed. Their uncle moved swiftly. Within weeks, both boys were declared illegitimate through an act of parliament, a legal maneuver that conveniently cleared Richard's path to the throne. He was crowned Richard III in July of that same year. And the princes? They were seen less and less frequently in the tower grounds. Witnesses who had glimpsed them playing or shooting arrows from the windows began reporting. Nothing. By autumn, the boys had simply stopped being seen at all. What followed was not an investigation. It was a silence so complete it became its own kind of evidence. No official announcement was ever made about their fate. No bodies were publicly displayed, as was customary in royal deaths of the era. No mourning period was declared. It was as though the English court had collectively agreed, perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of complicity, not to ask the question out loud. But people asked it quietly. They always do. The most enduring accusation points directly at Richard III himself. The motive was undeniable. The opportunity was absolute. And his reputation, both during his reign and in the centuries that followed, was shaped almost entirely by the assumption of his guilt. Shakespeare immortalized him as a scheming, physically grotesque villain, a portrayal so vivid it has colored public perception ever since. But was it accurate? Or was it Tudor propaganda, carefully constructed by the dynasty that defeated Richard at Bosworth Field in 1485 and needed a monster to justify their own seizure of power? Henry Stafford, the Duke of Buckingham, has also been named as a possible orchestrator, a man with proximity, ambition, and a history of political maneuvering. Others have pointed fingers at Henry Tudor himself, suggesting the boys may have survived long enough to become inconvenient to the new regime that replaced Richard. Then there is the theory that quiets rooms when it's mentioned, that at least one of the princes survived, that a young man known as Perkin Warbeck, who emerged in the 1490s claiming to be Richard, Duke of York, was not simply an imposter, but was exactly who he said he was. He gathered support across Europe. He was taken seriously by foreign courts, and when he was finally captured and executed by Henry VII, no attempt was made to publicly disprove his identity through evidence. That detail has never fully lost its weight. In 1674, workmen renovating a staircase inside the tower unearthed a wooden box containing 2 small skeletons. They were reinterred in Westminster Abbey on the assumption that these were the princes. But the remains have never been subjected to modern forensic DNA analysis, a request that has been made, debated, and quietly shelved multiple times over the decades. The bones are there. The science exists. And yet, one has to wonder what exactly anyone is afraid of finding. And yet, the Tower of London is not the only place where people simply vanished. Sometimes it wasn't one person or 2. Sometimes it was an entire civilization. Greenland today is what it has always been, vast, indifferent, and achingly remote. a landmass so large it distorts most maps and so sparsely populated that its silence feels less like peace and more like an absence. Stand on its southwestern coast, where the fjords cut deep into the rock and the light shifts in ways that make distances impossible to judge, and you begin to understand something fundamental. This is a place that does not forgive mistakes. It does not offer second chances, and it keeps its secrets with the patience of geological time. It was here in the late 10th century that a Norse explorer named Eric the Red arrived, exiled from Iceland for manslaughter, and chose to stay. What he found was harsh, but workable. Sheltered valleys where grass grew during the short summers. Coastlines rich with walrus, seal, and fish. He called it Greenland, a name that has puzzled historians ever since, given how little of it is actually green. Some believe it was deliberate marketing, a way to attract settlers to a place that needed a more appealing reputation than the frozen reality suggested. It worked. By around 985 AD, Eric returned with a fleet of colonists. At its height, the Norse Greenland settlement comprised two main communities, the eastern and western settlements, with a population estimated between 2,000 and 5,000 people. They built stone farmhouses. They raised cattle. They constructed a cathedral. They traded with Europe, sending walrus ivory, furs, and live polar bears across the North Atlantic in exchange for timber, iron, and grain. For nearly 500 years, they endured. And then, sometime in the mid-15th century, they were gone. Not gradually. Not in a way that left obvious explanations neatly behind. The Western settlement disappeared first, around 1350. The Eastern settlement held on longer, with the last written records placing a wedding there in 1408. A remarkably ordinary event, a marriage recorded in a church, surrounded by witnesses who had no apparent sense that their world was ending. After that entry, the record simply closes. No final dispatch, no call for help, no documented exodus. Just silence, of a different kind than the towers. Colder, wider, and somehow even harder to explain. The mainstream explanation begins with climate. The medieval warm period that had made Greenland viable for Norse farming gradually gave way to the onset of what scientists call the Little Ice Age. Temperatures dropped, growing seasons shortened. The sea ice that had once been navigable became increasingly impassable, cutting the settlements off from the European trade routes they depended on. Without regular supply ships, without the iron and timber they could not produce themselves, the colonies would have found survival increasingly difficult. But difficult is not the same as impossible, and the timeline doesn't quite add up cleanly. The Inuit, the indigenous people of the Arctic, were living successfully in Greenland throughout this same period. They had developed technologies and cultural practices specifically adapted to extreme cold. The kayak, the kajak hunting technique, insulated clothing made from seal and caribou hide. They not only survived the cooling climate, they thrived in it, which raises a question that archaeologists and historians have been wrestling with for decades. Why didn't the Norse simply adapt? The evidence suggests they tried, to a degree. Later, Norse settlements show signs of increased reliance on seal meat rather than cattle, a shift toward the kind of diet the Inuit had long mastered. Some Norse tools show modifications that appear influenced by indigenous designs. But the adaptation seems to have been reluctant, partial, and perhaps fatally slow. There are those who argue the Norse were undone not just by climate, but by identity. That their rigid adherence to European customs, to cattle farming, to Christian ecclesiastical structures, to a social hierarchy that depended on land ownership, made cultural flexibility nearly impossible. They were, in a sense, too committed to being Norse to become something new. Others have proposed more direct causes. Conflict with the Inuit has been suggested, though the archaeological record is ambiguous on this point. There are accounts in Norse sagas of violent encounters, but also of trade and coexistence. The relationship between the two peoples was almost certainly more complex than any single narrative can contain. Then there are the fringe theories. Quieter, harder to dismiss entirely. Some researchers have proposed that a portion of the colonists didn't die, but left. That faced with dwindling resources and increasing isolation, some Norse Greenlanders may have integrated into Inuit communities, their identities gradually absorbed rather than extinguished. Genetic studies of modern Inuit populations have been examined for traces of Norse ancestry, with results that are suggestive but not conclusive. The question remains open. Others point further west. The Norse, after all, had already reached North America. Leif Erikson's settlement at Lonso Meadows in Newfoundland predates the collapse of the Greenland colonies by centuries. Is it entirely impossible that some of the vanished colonists, desperate and resourceful, followed those same westward currents? No confirmed evidence supports this. But absence of evidence, as any historian will tell you, is not the same as evidence of absence. What the archaeological record does confirm is this. When European explorers eventually returned to Greenland in the early 16th century, they found abandoned farmhouses with roofs caved in, cattle bones scattered across stone floors, and possessions left behind in ways that suggested not a planned departure, but something more abrupt, more unresolved. Wooden objects had been carefully placed. Tools were left in position. It looked less like a community that had decided to leave, and more like one that had simply not come back from wherever they had gone. The Norse Greenlanders built a civilization at the edge of the known world and sustained it for 5 centuries. They baptized their children, buried their dead, and recorded a wedding that would turn out to be their last known act as a people. What happened in the years that followed remains to this day genuinely unknown. There is something particular about disappearances that happen not in one moment, but slowly, stretched across months and miles, unraveling piece by piece until there is almost nothing left to find. The Norse colonists faded across generations, but some vanishings happen faster. Some expeditions simply walk into a continent and do not walk back out. The Gulf Coast of Florida, even today, holds a quality that is difficult to articulate. Where the land meets the water, the boundary is never quite clear. Marshes bleed into bays. Mangrove roots tangle beneath brackish water that is neither river nor sea. The light, particularly in the long, humid months of summer, seems to flatten everything: distance, sound, time itself. It is a landscape that absorbs things. People have always known this. The indigenous nations who lived along these coasts for thousands of years understood it in their bones. Pánfilo de Narváez did not. In 1527, the Spanish crown granted Narváez the rights to conquer and colonize the vast territory the Spanish called Florida, a name that at the time referred not just to the peninsula we know today, but to a sweeping, poorly understood expanse of North America's southeastern and south-central interior. Narváez was a veteran of the Caribbean campaigns, a man who had survived considerable violence and political intrigue. He was experienced. He was ambitious. And he was, by nearly every account that followed, catastrophically ill-prepared for what awaited him. He departed Spain with 5 ships and approximately 600 men: soldiers, settlers, priests, and enslaved people. By the time his fleet reached the shores of Florida in April 1528, storms, desertion, and disease had already reduced his numbers significantly. He landed near present-day Tampa Bay, claimed the land for the Spanish crown with the appropriate ceremonies, and then made a decision that would doom his expedition almost immediately. He separated his forces. Narváez ordered the ships to sail northward along the coast and rendezvous with the land party further up the Gulf. The land party, roughly 300 men, would march inland. It seems in retrospect an almost inconceivable miscalculation. The ships and the land forces never found each other again. After waiting along the coast for nearly a year with no sign of the men, the fleet eventually gave up and sailed away. The land party was on its own. What followed was one of the most grueling and poorly documented journeys in the history of exploration. Narváez led his men northward through the Florida interior, chasing persistent rumors of gold in a place the indigenous people called Appalachia. The rumors, as rumors of gold so often did in this era, proved empty. What they found instead was dense forest, hostile terrain, and fierce resistance from the Appalachian people, who were defending their homeland against an armed foreign force with every tool available to them. The Spanish, weakened by hunger, heat, and disease, were ill-equipped to fight on unfamiliar ground. By the time they reached the northern Gulf Coast near present-day Apalachicola Bay, the expedition was desperate. They had lost men steadily to violence, illness, and the sheer attrition of the march. With no ships, no resupply, and no realistic path back the way they had come, Narváez ordered the construction of 5 crude rafts from whatever timber and materials they could gather. They melted down their armor and weapons to make tools and nails. They used their shirts to fashion sails. In September 1528, roughly 250 men pushed those rafts into the Gulf of Mexico and began coasting westward, hoping to reach the Spanish settlements in Mexico. They did not. Storms scattered the rafts almost immediately. Men died of thirst even surrounded by salt water. Others drowned. The indigenous communities along the Texas coast, some welcoming, some hostile, encountered a ragged, barely coherent remnant of what had once been a military expedition. Narváez himself was last seen alive on his raft, anchored offshore one night, refusing to come to land. By morning, he had drifted out to sea. He was never seen again. Of the original 600 who had left Spain, only 4 are known to have survived. Those 4, including a Moroccan-born enslaved man named Estevanico and a Spanish nobleman named Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca, spent the next 8 years wandering across the American Southwest and northern Mexico, living among indigenous nations, learning languages, and gradually making their way back toward Spanish territory. Cabeza de Vaca eventually wrote an account of the journey, the Relación, which remains one of the most extraordinary documents of the age of exploration. It is detailed, strange, and deeply human. It is also, by its own admission, incomplete, because Cabeza de Vaca could only record what he himself had witnessed, and the fate of the other 240-odd men who had pushed off from the Texas coast on those makeshift rafts, where they came ashore, where they died, whether any of them survived longer than the record suggests, remains largely unknown. Archaeologists have searched for physical evidence of the Narváez expedition for decades. Occasional finds, a Spanish artifact here, a disrupted burial site there, have offered tantalizing hints, but nothing conclusive. The exact route of the land march remains debated. The location of that final Florida encampment where the rafts were built has never been definitively identified. Some researchers have proposed that small groups may have survived longer than history records, living among indigenous communities, their Spanish origins gradually absorbed into the fabric of cultures that left no written records of their own. It is impossible to confirm. It is also, given what we know of similar cases, not impossible to imagine. Cabeza de Vaca returned to Spain and wrote his account. He tried to explain what the continent had done to his expedition, and to him. He did not fully succeed. Some experiences he seemed to understand resist the page. The Gulf Coast that swallowed Narváez's men still keeps its own counsel. The marshes are still there. The mangroves still tangle at the waterline. And somewhere beneath all of it, the full story waits. And yet, for all the vastness of the American interior, all those marshes and forests and unnamed rivers that swallowed Narváez and his men, there is another kind of disappearance entirely. One that happens not on land, but on water, where there is no terrain to search, no soil to excavate, no trail to follow, where the evidence, if it ever existed, was simply taken by the sea. The North Atlantic is not a forgiving place to look for answers. Even today, with satellite navigation and weather forecasting and vessels built from materials that would have seemed like sorcery to a 15th century sailor, the waters between Europe and the northeastern coast of North America command respect. In the early 16th century, those same waters were something closer to mythology made real, vast, unpredictable, and only beginning to be understood by the European minds attempting to chart them. The icebergs that calve from Greenland's glaciers and drift southward into the shipping lanes are silent and enormous. Fog rolls in without warning along the Labrador coast. Currents shift. Storms arrive faster than any sail can outrun them. It was into this world that Gaspar Corte-Real sailed, and from it he never returned. Gaspar came from a family already acquainted with exploration. His father, João Vaz Corte-Real, was a Portuguese nobleman who had served the crown in the Azores and was rumored, though never confirmed, to have made his own early voyage toward the western Atlantic. Whether that rumor shaped Gaspar's ambitions or whether he came to them independently is unclear. What is clear is that by the turn of the 16th century, he had secured the patronage of the Portuguese crown and the ships to act on whatever it was he was looking for. In 1500, Gaspar made his first documented voyage westward, reaching the coastline of what is now Newfoundland or Labrador. The historical record is imprecise about exactly where he landed. He returned to Portugal with favorable reports and, troublingly, with indigenous people taken from the coast by force. The crown was interested. A second voyage was organized almost immediately. In the spring of 1501, Gaspar departed Portugal again, this time commanding 3 ships. They sailed westward, reached the North American coastline, and began exploring southward along the coast. At some point during this voyage, the 3 ships separated. Whether by plan or by circumstance, the sources do not make entirely clear. 2 of the ships eventually turned back toward Portugal and arrived home safely in the autumn of 1501. Gaspar's ship did not. The 2 returning captains reported that they had last seen his vessel sailing along the coast. There was no storm mentioned, no obvious disaster, no final communication. He was simply there, and then he was not. The Portuguese crown, unwilling to accept the loss, organized a search expedition the following year, commanded, in a detail that adds its own layer of tragedy, by Gaspar's older brother Miguel. Miguel sailed in 1502 with 3 ships of his own. He reached the North American coastline and began searching. And then, in an almost unbearable echo of what had happened the year before, Miguel's ship also failed to return. His 2 companion vessels came back to Portugal. His did not. 2 brothers, 2 voyages, 2 disappearances separated by a single year. The same waters, the same silence. The Portuguese crown sent a 3rd expedition in 1503, this time led by a 3rd Corte-Real brother, Voyages. Whether out of an abundance of caution or a dawning sense that these waters were not giving anything back, Vasquez was ordered not to search beyond a certain point. He found nothing. He returned home, and with him, the official Portuguese search for the Corte-Real brothers effectively ended. The mainstream explanation is also the simplest. The North Atlantic coast of North America is genuinely treacherous, particularly for early 16th century vessels navigating without adequate charts, against unpredictable currents, among icebergs, and through fogs that could reduce visibility to near zero within minutes. Ships were lost with some regularity during the age of exploration, their fates never known. The most probable explanation is that Gaspar's ship encountered conditions it could not survive, sank, and left nothing recoverable behind. But the timing, the repetition, and the precision of the echoing pattern between the 2 brothers has always given historians pause. Some have speculated that Gaspar may have attempted to land, establish some form of contact or conflict with indigenous coastal peoples, and met his end on shore rather than at sea. The coastlines he was exploring were not uninhabited. The Beothuk people of Newfoundland, the various Innu and Mi'kmaq nations of the Labrador coast, these were established, capable peoples who had every reason to regard the arrival of European ships, given the slave-taking that had already occurred on Gaspar's first voyage, with something less than welcome. Others have proposed more speculatively that Gaspar may have survived longer than assumed, that his ship found harbor somewhere along the coast, that he wintered among indigenous peoples or in some improvised settlement, and that rescue simply never came. No physical evidence supports this, but the coastline he was exploring is long and still, in places remarkably isolated. There is one artifact that has entered the margins of this story and refused to leave entirely. A stone found in the late 19th century in Dighton, Massachusetts, covered in inscriptions that have been interpreted by some researchers as Portuguese and connected to the Corte-Real Voyages. The stone's inscriptions have also been read as Native American petroglyphs, as Phoenician, and as various other things, depending on who is doing the reading. No consensus has ever been reached. The stone sits in a museum. The debate around it continues quietly. What remains, stripped of speculation, is this. Two men sailed into the same waters, in the same years, searching for the same coastline. Neither one came back, and the sea, as it always has, offers nothing in the way of explanation. The sea gave no explanation for Gaspar. It would give none for Miguel either. There is a particular kind of grief that has no object, no body to bury, no wreckage to examine, no final letter to read by candlelight. It is the grief of the unresolved, and in the early 16th century, the Corte-Real family of Portugal knew it twice over. But what makes Miguel's disappearance distinct from his brother's is not simply that it happened. It is that it happened in full knowledge of what had come before. Miguel sailed into those waters already aware that Gaspar had not returned from them. He went anyway. And that choice, deliberate, documented, and ultimately fatal, is where this story truly begins. Lisbon in the early 1500s was a city alive with the energy of exploration. The Portuguese crown had built an empire on the willingness of its navigators to sail beyond the known edge of the world, and the returns, in spice, in gold, in territory, had made that willingness seem not just reasonable, but glorious. Disappearances were folded into the mathematics of ambition. Men were lost. Ships were lost. The enterprise continued. It was into this culture that Miguel Corte-Real launched his search, carrying with him both the weight of brotherhood and the sanction of the crown. He departed Portugal in May of 1502 with 3 ships, a mirror, almost deliberately, of his brother's final expedition. The symmetry must have felt purposeful at the time, perhaps even auspicious. 3 ships had gone with Gaspar. 3 ships would go to find him. The logic of it had a kind of order that the outcome would brutally dismantle. The 3 vessels crossed the Atlantic and reached the North American coastline, most likely somewhere along the coasts of what are now Newfoundland or Labrador. There, Miguel divided his fleet. This decision, to separate, to cover more ground, to cast a wider net in the search, was tactically understandable. It was also, as it had been for Narváez, for Gaspar, for so many commanders before and after, the last clear decision recorded before the silence began. The 2 companion ships waited at a pre-arranged rendezvous point. Miguel's ship did not appear. They waited longer. Still nothing. Eventually, as autumn pressed toward winter and the North Atlantic made its seasonal shift toward something no wooden vessel wanted to challenge, the 2 remaining captains made the only decision available to them. They turned their ships eastward and sailed home. They arrived in Lisbon in October of 1502. Miguel did not. What followed was a grief compounded by institutional exhaustion. The crown had now lost 2 expeditions, 2 ships, and 2 members of the same noble family to the same waters within the space of 2 years. A 3rd expedition was organized and dispatched in 1503 under the command of the youngest Corte-Real brother, Vasquez. But it was a muted effort, bounded by caution, and it returned empty-handed. After that, the Portuguese search for the Corte-Real brothers was quietly set aside. The waters had taken what they had taken. The ledger would not be balanced. The conventional explanation for Miguel's fate largely mirrors that offered for Gaspar's. The North Atlantic in the early 16th century was a genuinely dangerous environment for the vessels of that era. Small, wooden, dependent on wind, and navigated by instruments and methods that, while sophisticated for their time, left enormous margins for catastrophic error. Ice, storm, fog, and current were ever-present hazards. The coast of Labrador, in particular, with its labyrinthine bays and sudden weather, has claimed ships across every century of recorded navigation. The most straightforward reading of Miguel's disappearance is simply that his ship was lost at sea, in waters that offered no survivors and left no wreckage within reach of any search. But the exact repetition of circumstances, the same coastline, the same separation of ships, the same failure of one vessel to return, has always invited a slightly different line of inquiry. Some researchers have proposed that Miguel may have succeeded where Gaspar apparently did not, that his ship found a harbor, that he came ashore, and that what ended him was not the sea, but the land. The indigenous peoples of the Newfoundland and Labrador coasts had by this point experienced at least one documented instance of Portuguese sailors taking captives from their communities. Gaspar's first voyage had returned to Portugal with indigenous people removed by force. The communities along that coastline would have had reason to respond to the arrival of subsequent Portuguese vessels with something other than hospitality. Whether this theory has merit is impossible to confirm. No indigenous oral tradition has been conclusively connected to either Corte-Real disappearance. The archaeological record along those coastlines has not yielded any artifact definitively linked to either expedition. The absence of evidence runs in every direction simultaneously. There is, however, one thread that researchers have returned to periodically: the Dighton Rock, that inscribed stone found in Massachusetts whose markings have been interpreted in so many conflicting ways. One reading, proposed by Portuguese scholars in the 19th century and revisited occasionally since, suggests the inscriptions include a date, 1511, and a reference to Miguel Corte-Real by name. If that reading were accurate, it would imply that Miguel survived his disappearance by nearly a decade, living somewhere on the North American coast, far from any European settlement, long enough to carve his name into stone as some kind of testament. The mainstream scholarly consensus does not accept this interpretation. The inscriptions remain contested. The stone remains ambiguous, and the gap between what the evidence can support and what the imagination reaches for remains, as it so often does in these stories, unbridged. What history preserves with certainty is this: a brother went looking for a brother. He brought 3 ships and the authorization of a crown. He had every reason, every resource, and every motivation that the age could provide. And somewhere along a coastline that is still in places as remote and unforgiving as it was in 1502, whatever happened to him happened beyond the reach of any record that has yet been found. 2 brothers, 1 ocean, no answers. Perhaps the most honest thing that can be said is also the most uncomfortable: that some disappearances are not mysteries waiting to be solved. They are simply absences, permanent, silent, and complete. Though one cannot help wondering, even now, whether that stone has more to say. Not all mysteries live in open water or unmapped wilderness. Some happen behind closed doors, in candlelit chambers, in the heart of the most powerful institutions in the world. And sometimes, the closer a death occurs to the center of power, the harder it becomes to see clearly. Ludlow Castle sits on a sandstone bluff above the River Timay in Shropshire, England, a medieval fortress that once served as the administrative heart of the Welsh Marches. Today it stands in elegant ruin, its roofless towers open to the sky, its great hall reduced to shell and shadow. Visitors walk through it on sunny afternoons, reading plaques and consulting guidebooks, mostly unaware that within these walls, in the early spring of 1502, something happened that quietly redirected the entire course of English history. A 15-year-old boy died here, and the questions surrounding that death have never been fully resolved. Prince Arthur Tudor was, by every measure available to the English crown, the future. The eldest son of Henry VII, he had been groomed for kingship from infancy, named deliberately for the legendary British king, educated rigorously, and presented to the European courts as the living proof that the Tudor dynasty was stable, legitimate, and built to last. In November of 1501, he married Catherine of Aragon, the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, in a ceremony of considerable splendor at St. Paul's Cathedral in London. The alliance was diplomatic as much as personal, a signal to Europe that England had arrived as a serious power. The young couple traveled to Ludlow Castle shortly after the wedding, as was customary. Arthur, as Prince of Wales, was expected to preside over the administration of the region. They settled into the castle through the winter months. And then, in March and April of 1502, both Arthur and Catherine fell seriously ill. Catherine recovered. Arthur did not. He died on the 2nd of April, 1502, having been married for approximately 5 months. The official cause recorded at the time was something contemporaries called the sweating sickness, a disease that swept through Tudor England in periodic epidemic waves, striking quickly and sometimes killing within hours. It was real, it was documented, and it had claimed lives across the country in that same period. As explanations go, it is neither implausible nor remarkable. And yet, the sweating sickness, while genuinely deadly, was also notably indiscriminate. It struck across social classes, across age groups, across the full spectrum of Tudor society. Catherine had been in the same castle, under the same conditions, exposed to the same environment. She fell ill at the same time. Why did she survive when Arthur did not? The gap in the historical record is not suspicious in itself. Medicine in 1502 was not a precise science, and individual immune responses are unpredictable in any era. But the gap exists, and it has allowed questions to accumulate around it for centuries. Some historians have proposed that Arthur was already in poor health before the sweating sickness arrived, that he was constitutionally fragile in ways that contemporaries either did not fully recognize or chose not to publicize, given the political implications of an heir who appeared weak. Descriptions of Arthur from those who knew him suggest a slight, perhaps underweight young man who may have struggled physically even before his marriage. If his immune system was already compromised, the sweating sickness would have found easier purchase. Others have pointed to the conditions at Ludlow itself. The castle, for all its administrative importance, was not known for comfort. The Welsh marches in winter were cold, damp, and exposed. The water supply and sanitation arrangements of a medieval fortress, even a well-maintained one, left considerable room for secondary infections to complicate whatever primary illness had taken hold. Arthur may have died not from one cause, but from a cascade of them. Then there are the more speculative lines of inquiry. Quieter, less academically fashionable, but not entirely without basis. Some researchers have revisited the question of whether Arthur's illness was truly what it was recorded as being, or whether the sweating sickness was a convenient diagnosis applied to a death whose actual cause was less straightforward to explain. It is worth remembering that Arthur's death had enormous political consequences. His younger brother Henry now became heir to the throne. The same Henry who would eventually become Henry VII, reshape the English Church and alter the religious landscape of Europe. The redistribution of that much power tends, historically, to generate its own shadows. There is also the matter of Catherine of Aragon's own testimony, given years later during the annulment proceedings that Henry VIII initiated against her. Catherine consistently maintained, under considerable political pressure to say otherwise, that her marriage to Arthur had never been consummated, that Arthur had been too ill, too young, or too physically incapable to fulfill the marital relationship. Her insistence on this point had enormous theological and legal implications for the annulment case. Henry's lawyers argued the opposite. Neither side produced conclusive evidence. Whether Arthur and Catherine's marriage was consummated is, in one sense, a private question about two teenagers in a castle 5 centuries ago. In another sense, it is the question on which the English Reformation partly turned. Because if the marriage had been valid in the fullest sense, Catherine's subsequent marriage to Henry VIII required a papal dispensation, whose legitimacy became the central legal argument of one of the most consequential divorce cases in Western history. The death of a 15-year-old boy at Ludlow Castle in the spring of 1502 rippled forward in time in ways that no one present could have imagined. It changed a dynasty. It changed a church. It changed a continent. And the precise circumstances of that death, what Arthur truly suffered from, how long he had been declining, what passed between him and Catherine in those final weeks, remain known only to the walls of a castle that has long since lost its roof. Some rooms, it seems, keep their secrets even after the ceiling is gone. Power, it seems, has always had a complicated relationship with those who think too freely. Prince Arthur's death reshaped a dynasty from within its own walls. But sometimes the threat to power comes not from a rival claimant or a political maneuver. It comes from an idea. From a mind that asks questions the established order would prefer left unasked. Florence in the late 15th century was the closest thing the Western world had to an intellectual sunrise. The Medici had turned the city into a crucible of art, philosophy, and humanist thought. A place where ancient Greek manuscripts arrived from the fallen Byzantine Empire and were read with the urgency of new discoveries, where painters and philosophers moved in the same circles, where the boundaries between the sacred and the secular were being quietly, persistently renegotiated. It was a world that produced Leonardo, Botticelli, and Machiavelli within the same generation, and it produced Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, a young man so extraordinarily gifted, so relentlessly curious, that even in that company he stood apart. Pico was born in 1463 into a noble family in the small lordship of Mirandola in northern Italy. He was reading Latin and Greek by adolescence. By his early 20s, he had studied at Bologna, Ferrara, Padua, and Paris, absorbing not just the mainstream currents of Renaissance thought but the more esoteric tributaries: Kabbalah, Hermeticism, Arabic philosophy, Neoplatonism. He moved through intellectual traditions the way a musician moves through keys, finding harmonies that others hadn't thought to look for. In 1486, at the age of 23, he announced something remarkable even by the standards of Renaissance ambition. He would travel to Rome and publicly defend 900 theses. 900 separate philosophical and theological propositions drawn from every intellectual tradition he had encountered, against any scholar in Europe who wished to challenge them. He would pay the travel expenses of anyone who came to debate him. The debate never happened. Pope Innocent VIII appointed a commission to examine the theses. 13 of them were declared heretical. The rest were deemed suspect. Pico was condemned, briefly imprisoned in France, and spent years under a cloud of papal disapproval that only lifted when Alexander VI granted him a formal absolution in 1493. By then, Pico had settled in Florence under the protection of Lorenzo de' Medici, the city's de facto ruler and the most sophisticated cultural patron of the age. He was writing, studying, moving increasingly toward a more ascetic and spiritually serious mode of life, influenced in part by the Dominican friar Girolamo Savonarola, whose fiery sermons about moral corruption were beginning to shake Florence from its humanist complacency. Pico seemed in his final years to be in transition, moving away from the dazzling intellectual exhibitionism of his youth toward something quieter and more inward. He was 31 years old when Lorenzo de' Medici died in April of 1492. He was 31 years old when he himself died in November of that same year. The official cause was fever. He declined rapidly over the course of several weeks, his body failing in ways that contemporary physicians could neither explain nor effectively treat. He died on the 17th of November, 1494. The same day, by a coincidence that historians have noted with varying degrees of significance, that the French King Charles VIII entered Florence at the head of an invading army, an event that marked the beginning of the end of Medici dominance in the city. For 5 centuries, the fever was accepted as explanation enough. Renaissance Italy was not short of diseases capable of killing a young man quickly. The matter seemed closed. Then, in 2007, it was reopened. Italian researchers exhumed Pico's remains from the Church of San Marco in Florence and subjected them to modern forensic analysis. What they found was unexpected. The levels of arsenic detected in Pico's bones were significantly elevated, high enough, the researchers concluded, to suggest arsenic poisoning as a probable cause or major contributing factor in his death. Arsenic was the preferred poison of Renaissance Italy. It was tasteless, relatively slow-acting in sufficient doses, and produced symptoms, fever, weakness, gastrointestinal distress, that were essentially indistinguishable from natural illness in an era before toxicology existed as a discipline. It was called, with grim appropriateness, the inheritance powder, because of how frequently it appeared in cases involving wills, estates, and the removal of inconvenient relatives. Its use required access, knowledge, and proximity to the victim. The question that the 2007 findings opened was not whether Pico had been poisoned. The forensic evidence suggested strongly that he had. The question was who had done it and why. The suspects, once one begins to look, are not difficult to imagine. Pico had accumulated enemies with the efficiency that only genuine intellectual independence can produce. His 900 theses had embarrassed the papacy. His synthesis of Christian theology with Jewish Kabbalah and Islamic philosophy had unsettled Orthodox thinkers across multiple traditions. His proximity to the Medici made him a figure of political as well as intellectual significance. And his growing relationship with Savonarola, whose influence was becoming a destabilizing force in Florentine politics, may have made him inconvenient to any number of parties whose interests Savonarola threatened. Some historians have pointed toward agents of the Borgia papacy, Alexander VI, whose absolution of Pico had been genuine enough on paper, but who presided over a court not known for sentiment toward those who complicated its authority. Others have suggested rivals within the Florentine intellectual and political landscape itself. Still others have proposed that the poisoning, if it was deliberate, may have been opportunistic, someone taking advantage of an existing illness to ensure a particular outcome. No definitive answer has emerged. The forensic findings establish the what with reasonable confidence. The who and the why remain open. What remains most striking, in the end, is the timing. A mind that had spent its brief life building bridges between traditions, between Christianity and Kabbalah, between Plato and Aristotle, between the sacred and the philosophical, died at 31 on the day a foreign army arrived to dismantle the world that had made him possible. Whether those two facts are connected or simply adjacent is a question the historical record cannot yet answer. And perhaps that is the most unsettling thing of all. The Borgias understood poison. If the forensic evidence surrounding Pico della Mirandola points toward anyone's orbit, it points, at least in part, toward theirs. And yet, with a symmetry that history rarely manufactures so neatly, the family most associated with the quiet art of political poisoning would itself become the subject of darker questions. Because the death of Cesare Borgia, the most feared man in Renaissance Italy, was neither quiet nor clean, and it has never been entirely explained. The town of Viana sits in the Kingdom of Navarre in northern Spain, modest and sun-warmed, the kind of place that feels removed from the larger currents of history. A small church, narrow streets, the unhurried pace of a provincial town that has long since made its peace with being overlooked. And yet, just outside its walls, on the 12th of March 1507, one of the most extraordinary and terrifying figures of the Renaissance era bled out on the ground after an ambush that should, by any reasonable calculation, not have been able to kill him. Cesare Borgia was 31 years old, the same age, with grim precision, as Pico della Mirandola at his death. To understand why his death feels incomplete, it is necessary to understand who Cesare was, and what he had survived to reach that road outside Viana. He was the son of Pope Alexander VI, born into a family whose name had become synonymous, even in their own lifetime, with ambition without scruple. He had been made a cardinal at 17, a position he later renounced, the first man in history to formally resign from the cardinalate in order to pursue the military and political career that he believed was his true calling. He became captain general of the papal armies. He carved a personal domain out of central Italy through a combination of military force, strategic marriage alliances, and what contemporaries described with barely concealed awe as a near-total absence of moral restraint. Machiavelli observed him directly, studied him carefully, and used him as the closest thing the prince had to a working model of effective power. That is the measure of the man. He was the real-world reference point for the most consequential political treatise of the Renaissance. He had also, by the time of his death, lost almost everything. The collapse began with his father. Pope Alexander VI died in August of 1503 under circumstances that were, in a detail historians find difficult to overlook, themselves suspicious. A sudden and violent illness that struck both the Pope and Cesare simultaneously at a dinner whose other guests emerged unaffected. The suspicion of poisoning was immediate and widespread, though whether Alexander died from poison, from malaria, or from some combination of the two has never been conclusively established. Cesare survived, but the illness left him physically diminished at precisely the moment he needed his full strength. Without his father's papal authority as a foundation, Cesare's political architecture collapsed with startling speed. His enemies, who had been numerous and patient, moved against him. He was arrested, imprisoned in the Castel Sant'Angelo, transferred to Spain, held in the castle of La Mota. In 1506 he escaped, a feat that required considerable physical courage and ingenuity, and made his way to Navarre, where his brother-in-law Jean d'Albret offered him refuge in a military command. It was in the service of the King of Navarre that he rode out on that March morning in 1507, pursuing a group of rebel knights near Viana. He rode ahead of his escort, either from impatience, from overconfidence, or from a tactical misjudgment, and found himself suddenly alone, surrounded by a group of enemy soldiers who unhorsed him and attacked. The wounds he received were, by contemporary accounts, extreme. One chronicle describes more than 20 separate injuries, including multiple lance wounds to the body and face. The ferocity of the assault suggested something beyond a chance military encounter. It read, to those who recorded it, more like an execution than a skirmish. This is where the mainstream account and the speculative one begin to diverge. The official narrative is straightforward enough. Cesare rode into an ambush, was unhorsed, overwhelmed by numbers, and killed. It was a reckless death, perhaps, unfitting even for a man of his calculated intelligence, but not an inexplicable one. Military history is full of brilliant commanders who died from a single moment of poor judgment in the field, but the specific brutality of the attack has always prompted questions. Who were these rebel knights exactly, and who was behind them? The political landscape of Navarre in 1507 was complex and fractious, with competing noble factions and external pressures from both France and the Spanish crown. Cesare, even in exile, even stripped of his Italian domains, was not a politically neutral figure. He retained connections, loyalties, and, perhaps most dangerously, knowledge. He knew where bodies were buried, in the most literal as well as the figurative sense. He knew the private machinations of the papal court during his father's reign. He knew things about the Borgia years that powerful people in Rome, in Spain, and across Italy would have had strong reasons to ensure remained unspoken. Some historians have proposed that the ambush was not opportunistic, but arranged. That Cesare was lured into that position, that his separation from his escort was engineered rather than accidental, and that the men who killed him were acting on instructions that originated considerably higher than a Navarrese rebel faction. The identity of any such orchestrator has never been established. The Spanish crown had reasons. Certain Italian noble families had reasons. Even the new papal administration under Julius II, who had been among Cesare's most determined enemies, had reasons. No evidence has surfaced to confirm any of these threads. What the record preserves is only the outcome. A man who had outmaneuvered half of Europe for a decade, who had escaped one of Spain's most secure castles, who had survived poison and illness and political annihilation, died on an unremarkable road in northern Spain, outnumbered and alone. Whether that was misfortune or design remains, like so much in the Borgia story, precisely and deliberately obscure. Cesare Borgia died on a road he should never have been on alone, in a place far removed from the centers of power he had spent his life navigating. But there is another kind of death that belongs to this same era. One that happens not in the corridors of Renaissance politics, but at the outermost edge of the known world, where maps ran out and the margin notes simply read, as they sometimes literally did, "Here be dangers." The age of exploration was generating mysteries as fast as it was generating discoveries. and one of the most overlooked belongs to a man who, more than almost anyone else of his generation, understood the shape of the world as it was being revealed. Juan de la Cosa carried that world in his hands. The Mappa Mundi that bears his name, completed in the year 1500 and housed today in the Museo Naval in Madrid, is one of the most significant cartographic documents in human history. It is the first known map to show the Americas as a continuous landmass, drawn by a man who had sailed those waters himself and was attempting, with the tools and knowledge available to him, to make sense of what European eyes were only beginning to see. The map is large, detailed, and painted on what is believed to be oxhide. It is also in places deliberately ambiguous, as though its maker understood that some of what he knew could not yet be safely committed to permanent record. Juan de la Cosa was present at the beginning of things. He had sailed with Columbus on the first voyage in 1492, serving as master of the Santa Maria, the flagship that ran aground on the coast of Hispaniola on Christmas Day of that year, an event that forced the establishment of the first European settlement in the Americas. He sailed with Columbus again on the second voyage. He sailed with Alonso de Ojeda and Amerigo Vespucci along the northern coast of South America. He made at least 6 Atlantic crossings in total, accumulating a geographic knowledge of the New World that was, by the early 1500s, unmatched by any other European navigator. He was, in short, indispensable. A man whose mind contained information that no document had yet fully captured, whose experience of the American coastlines was both broader and deeper than almost anyone alive. And then, in 1510, he was dead. Killed in circumstances that are documented in their basic outline, but have always carried a faint quality of the unexplained. De la Cosa had joined an expedition led by Alonso de Ojeda to the coast of present-day Colombia, in the region the Spanish called Tierra Firme. The expedition's objective was colonization, the establishment of a permanent Spanish presence on the South American mainland. It was an ambitious undertaking in a region where previous Spanish incursions had encountered fierce and organized resistance from the indigenous Yoruba people, who had developed effective defenses against European intrusions into their territory. In February of 1510, a party led by de la Cosa went ashore near the Gulf of Urabá. They encountered an ambush. The attack was swift, overwhelming, and precise, the Urabá warriors using poisoned arrows with a devastating effectiveness that the Spanish, accustomed to the military dynamics of the Caribbean islands, had not fully anticipated. De la Cosa was struck by multiple arrows and died, according to the accounts that survived, either during the ambush itself or shortly after. Ojeda, who arrived with reinforcements to find the aftermath, reportedly discovered de la Cosa's body, swollen, according to the chronicles, from the effects of the poison. He buried him and withdrew. The mainstream account presents this as a tragic but not unusual outcome of the violent contact that characterized early Spanish colonization of the Americas. Indigenous resistance was real, organized, and often devastatingly effective against European forces who underestimated it. The ambush near Urabá was one episode in a long pattern of such encounters. De la Cosa's death, in this reading, was the death of an experienced man caught in a situation his experience had not prepared him for. But certain details have always invited a second look. De la Cosa was not a young man by the standards of his era. He was likely in his 50s, an age at which most men of his generation and background would have been far removed from the front lines of a colonial skirmish. Why was he personally leading a shore party into territory known to be hostile? His value to the Spanish enterprise was strategic and cartographic. He was a navigator and a knowledge repository, not a foot soldier. Sending him ashore in a situation of known danger seems, at minimum, like a significant lapse in judgment on someone's part. Some historians have noted that de la Cosa's relationship with Ojeda had its complexities. The two men had collaborated across multiple voyages, but had also navigated the competitive and politically fraught world of Spanish colonial ambition, where cartographic knowledge was a form of currency, and those who possessed it were sometimes as much rivals as allies. Whether any tension in that relationship bore on the circumstances of de la Cosa's death is impossible to establish from the surviving record. There is also the matter of what de la Cosa knew that has since been lost. His 1500 map represents a snapshot of geographic understanding at a specific moment. But in the decade between that map and his death, he had made additional voyages, gathered additional knowledge, and carried in his memory a picture of the American coastlines that was more current and more detailed than anything committed to surviving paper. Whatever he knew died with him on that Colombian shore. The map in Madrid endures. The man who made it left behind no final account, no updated chart, no record of what a decade of additional observation had added to his understanding of the world's shape. He had held the contours of a new world in his mind. And when he fell, that particular map, the one that existed only in his memory, disappeared with him forever. Some knowledge once lost cannot be recovered. Juan de la Cosa carried the contours of a new world in his memory, and when he died, that interior map died with him. But knowledge is not the only thing that powerful men carry in silence. Sometimes they carry secrets, political, dynastic, deeply personal, that their deaths make permanently inaccessible. And sometimes the manner of their dying becomes its own kind of secret. Richmond Palace no longer exists in any meaningful form. What remains today is a scattering of architectural fragments absorbed into the fabric of a London suburb. A gatehouse here, a remnant of Tudor brickwork there, enough to suggest former grandeur without conveying it. But in the early 16th century, Richmond was one of the finest royal residences in England, rebuilt by Henry VII after fire destroyed the older Palace of Sheen, and regarded by contemporaries as a monument to Tudor taste and ambition. It was here, in the spring of 1509, that the first Tudor king lay dying. And the precise nature of what was killing him was, by deliberate arrangement, being kept from almost everyone. Henry VII had spent 24 years on the English throne, a reign defined above all by survival. He had taken the crown at Bosworth Field in 1485, a relatively obscure Lancastrian claimant who defeated Richard III in battle and found himself king almost by improvisation. What followed was a sustained and sophisticated exercise in consolidating power, suppressing rebellions, neutralizing rivals, building financial reserves through taxation and shrewd economic management, and constructing the legal and institutional foundations of a dynasty that had not, when he started, seemed guaranteed to last a decade. By the final years of his reign, he had succeeded. The Tudors were established. The treasury was full. The major threats had been neutralized, but Henry himself had become something that contemporaries found difficult to describe without a certain unease. A king who trusted almost no one, who accumulated money with an intensity that shaded into compulsion, and who had withdrawn from the more public dimensions of royal life in ways that were becoming increasingly difficult to explain away. His health had been declining for several years before his death. Precisely what was wrong with him is where the historical record becomes careful and selective in ways that are themselves informative. The condition most frequently mentioned in contemporary accounts was pulmonary tuberculosis, consumption in the language of the era, a disease that was endemic in Tudor England and would claim several members of the dynasty across generations. Its progression in Henry's case was apparently slow, spanning years rather than months, with periods of partial recovery followed by further decline. By early 1509, those close to him understood that recovery was no longer a realistic expectation. What makes Henry's final illness historically interesting is not the diagnosis itself. Tuberculosis was a common enough killer, but the extraordinary secrecy that surrounded his deterioration. As Henry weakened through the winter and spring of 1509, the information was managed with a control that bordered on the theatrical. Ambassadors at the English court were reporting to their governments that the king appeared healthy when he was, by other accounts, barely capable of sustained physical activity. The number of individuals with direct access to Henry was drastically reduced. Business was conducted through intermediaries. Even the formal announcement of his death, when it finally came on the 21st of April 1509, was delayed by 2 days before being made public, a detail that generated immediate speculation about what those 2 days had been used for. The mainstream explanation for this secrecy is political rather than conspiratorial. a dying king with only one surviving male heir, the 17-year-old Prince Henry, not yet the towering figure of history he would become, represented a moment of dynastic vulnerability. Any perception of weakness could have invited destabilizing challenges. Keeping the king's condition obscured was, in this reading, simply prudent statecraft. It is a reasonable explanation. It may also be an incomplete one. Some historians have examined Henry's final years with attention to the behavioral and physical changes that contemporaries documented: the withdrawal, the suspicion, the compulsive financial activity, the narrowing of his circle of trust, and propose that tuberculosis alone may not fully account for the picture. The symptoms in some readings are consistent with additional conditions. Depression following the death of his wife Elizabeth of York in 1503, certainly, but possibly also physical ailments that went unrecorded or were deliberately omitted from the accounts that survived. There is also the matter of what Henry did with his final weeks. The records of his last communications, his last directives, his last arrangements, many of which were conducted through a very small number of trusted advisors, have not survived in complete form. Whether through the ordinary attrition of time, the deliberate management of the historical record by those who came after, or simple administrative entropy, the documentation of Henry VII's death is thinner than one might expect for a king who was, in virtually every other dimension of his reign, meticulous about record-keeping. Henry VIII came to the throne on the 22nd of April, 1509, and one of his first acts was to arrest two of his father's most trusted financial administrators, Edmund Dudley and Richard Empson, on charges of constructive treason. Both were eventually executed. Whether their arrest represented genuine accountability for abuses committed under Henry VII, or a convenient political distancing by a new king eager to establish a different tone, has been debated ever since. It is worth noting that Dudley and Empson were among the very few men who had been in close proximity to Henry VII in his final months. Whatever they had witnessed, whatever they had been told, whatever arrangements they had been party to in those carefully sealed chambers at Richmond Palace, all of it went with them when they were executed in 1510. Henry VII built his dynasty on the careful management of information. Even his dying, it seems, was no exception. What passed in those final hours at Richmond, what was said, what was decided, what was quietly set in motion, remains beyond the reach of the record. And perhaps that is precisely how he intended it. Henry VII managed information the way other kings managed armies, with precision, with patience, and with a clear understanding that what people did not know could be as powerful as what they did. But information, even when carefully controlled, has a way of surfacing in unexpected places. Sometimes it appears in documents, sometimes in testimonies, and sometimes in one of the strangest and most consequential cases in the history of cartography. It appears on a map that knew things it should not have known, a map that named a continent before anyone had fully agreed the continent existed, and a map whose sources, 5 centuries later, remain genuinely, troublingly unclear. The Library of Congress in Washington holds many remarkable objects, but among them, displayed under carefully controlled lighting and temperature in a room designed specifically for its preservation, is a document that has been called, without significant exaggeration, America's birth certificate. It is a large woodcut map, printed in 12 separate sheets and assembled to form a single image approximately 130 centimeters tall and 240 centimeters wide. It was produced in 1507 in the small town of Saint-Dié-des-Vosges in what is now northeastern France, by a cartographer and scholar named Martin Waldseemüller. It is the first document in recorded history to use the word America. That fact alone would make it significant. But the word is not the mystery. The mystery is what the map shows, and how Waldseemüller could possibly have known to show it. The map depicts, with reasonable accuracy for its era, the coastlines of Europe and Africa, the outlines of Asia, and the newly encountered landmasses of the Western Atlantic. It places the Americas as a separate continent, distinct from Asia, a conceptual leap that was, in 1507, not yet universally accepted among European geographers. Columbus himself had died the previous year, still maintaining that what he had found was the eastern edge of Asia. And yet Waldseemüller drew the Americas as something new, something separate, something that required its own name. He called the southern landmass America, in honor of Amerigo Vespucci, the Florentine navigator whose published letters describing the South American coast had convinced Waldseemüller and his colleagues that what Vespucci had seen was not Asia, but an entirely distinct part of the world. The map was produced alongside a companion text, the Cosmographiae Introductio, which explained the naming and outlined the geographic reasoning behind it. So far, the historical narrative is relatively coherent, but then one looks more carefully at the map itself, and the questions begin. The Pacific Ocean appears on the Waldseemüller map, not prominently, not in detail, but present, a body of water to the west of the Americas, separating them from Asia. This is deeply strange. The first confirmed European sighting of the Pacific from the American continent came in 1513, when Vasco Núñez de Balboa crossed the Isthmus of Panama and looked out at what he called the South Sea. That was 6 years after Waldseemüller's map was printed. How did Waldseemüller know there was an ocean there? The standard explanation offered by historians is that this portion of the map was speculative, that Waldseemüller extrapolated from existing geographic theory, from Ptolemaic models of world geography, and from the logical inference that if the Americas were not Asia, then something must lie between them and Asia's eastern coast. In this reading, the Pacific on the 1507 map is an educated guess that happened to be correct, not evidence of undisclosed knowledge. It is a reasonable argument. It is also one that leaves a residue of discomfort that is never quite dissipated. The accuracy of the map's South American coastline has also attracted sustained attention. The outline of the continent, particularly its eastern coast, corresponds with a fidelity to reality that seems, given the documented voyages available to Waldseemüller in 1507, somewhat ahead of what those voyages alone should have produced. Vespucci's published accounts describe his explorations, but the precision with which certain coastal features appear on the map has led some researchers to propose that Waldseemüller had access to additional source material, charts, logs, or surveys, that has since been lost or was never made public. This is where the speculation begins to open in multiple directions simultaneously. One line of inquiry focuses on the Portuguese. By 1507, Portugal had been conducting systematic exploration of the South American coast, and its cartographers, working under conditions of strict royal secrecy, since geographic knowledge was a strategic asset of the First Order, had almost certainly accumulated detailed coastal surveys that were never intended for general circulation. Whether any of that information reached Waldseemüller, through diplomatic channels, through intermediaries, or through the kind of informal knowledge sharing that occurred among scholars and humanist networks, is unknown. Portugal's cartographic archives from this period are incomplete, and the gaps in them are not always easily explained. Another line of inquiry concerns the Vespucci letters themselves. The published versions of Vespucci's accounts, particularly the Mundus Novus and the Lettera, contain geographic descriptions that have been analyzed repeatedly for internal consistency, and the results have been contested. Some scholars have argued that the published letters were edited, expanded, or in certain passages fabricated, either by Vespucci himself or by those who published his accounts after the fact. If the letters that reached Waldseemüller contained information beyond what Vespucci had actually observed, the question of where that additional information originated becomes considerably more interesting. Then there is the question of what Waldseemüller himself knew, and when. In 1513, he produced a second major map, and in it, something remarkable happened. The name America, which he had coined and printed in 1507 on 1,000 copies distributed across Europe, was quietly removed. The continent that had been named on his own earlier map was relabeled Terra Incognita, unknown land. He offered no explanation for the change. Historians have proposed various reasons. Perhaps Waldseemüller had become convinced that the attribution to Vespucci was incorrect, that Columbus, or someone else, deserved priority. Perhaps he had received new information that complicated his earlier certainty. Perhaps there were political or institutional pressures at work that the surviving record does not illuminate. He never publicly explained the retraction. The name America survived anyway, carried forward by the momentum of the 1507 map's distribution, until it became simply the word for what it described. But the man who coined it apparently came to doubt it, and took his reasons to the grave. What Waldseemüller knew, where he learned it, and why he walked back the most consequential label in the history of cartography. These questions sit at the intersection of geography, politics, and the always murky business of how knowledge moves through the world. The map endures. The sources behind it remain after 5 centuries of scholarship not fully accounted for. And the ocean it showed before anyone had officially seen it stretches westward still, indifferent to the question of how it came to be drawn. Maps, as we have seen, can hold secrets that outlast the people who made them. Waldseemüller drew an ocean that Europeans had not yet officially seen, and named a continent in ways he later recanted without explanation. But the world those maps were attempting to capture was itself being written in real time, by sailors and navigators who were disappearing into it as fast as they were charting it. Some came back, some did not, and some came back in ways that raised more questions than their absence would have. The Indian Ocean has a quality that the Atlantic, for all its vastness, does not quite replicate. It is a closed sea in the geographical sense, bounded by land masses on 3 sides, governed by monsoon winds that shift direction with the seasons in patterns so reliable that Asian traders had been exploiting them for millennia before any European vessel entered those waters. It rewards those who understand its rhythms. It punishes, swiftly and completely, those who do not. And in the early 16th century, as Portuguese fleets began pressing further and further into its currents, it claimed ships and men with a regularity that the crown in Lisbon absorbed as simply the cost of empire. João de Nova understood the Indian Ocean. That much is established. He was a Galician-born navigator in Portuguese service, one of a generation of extraordinary maritime commanders who made the eastern trade routes not merely possible, but routine. In 1501, he commanded the 3rd Portuguese fleet to reach India, discovering the island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic on the outward journey. A discovery significant enough to carry his name into the permanent record. He returned to Lisbon successfully. He returned to India again. He was experienced, capable, and trusted by the crown, with command-level responsibility on some of the most consequential voyages of the age. And then, somewhere between India and Portugal, things went wrong in ways that the historical record captures only partially and with maddening imprecision. The details of João de Nova's final years at sea are fragmentary in ways that are unusual even for the documentary standards of early 16th century Portuguese exploration. What is established is that he remained active in the Indian Ocean trade routes into the first decade of the 1500s, that his later voyages were marked by a series of difficulties, disputes with other commanders, accusations of misconduct, confiscated cargo, legal proceedings initiated against him by the crown, and that he died in India, in Cochin, around 1509, under circumstances that the surviving record describes only in the broadest terms. He did not disappear at sea in the way that Gaspar Corte-Real disappeared, or Narváez, or the others whose absences form clean, dramatic breaks in the historical narrative. His vanishing was slower, more institutional, more bureaucratic in texture. He was a man who became progressively less visible in the record, not because the sea swallowed him, but because the machinery of colonial administration seemed, deliberately or otherwise, to have closed around him. This is where the straightforward account ends and the questions begin. The accusations leveled against João de Nova in his later career centered primarily on the unauthorized seizure of cargo, essentially allegations of operating outside the strict trading monopoly that the Portuguese crown maintained over the India routes. These were serious charges in the context of the Estado de India, the administrative structure through which Portugal managed its Eastern Empire. The monopoly was the economic foundation of the entire enterprise, and commanders who operated independently of it were threatening something considerably larger than their own careers. But the specific nature of what de Nova was accused of seizing, and from whom, and under what circumstances, is documented with a selectiveness that historians have found frustrating. The legal proceedings against him generated paperwork, as legal proceedings do, but the paperwork that has survived is incomplete. Key documents appear to be missing, not in the dramatic sense of having been obviously destroyed, but in the quieter sense that the archival record simply has gaps where continuity would be expected. Some researchers have proposed that de Nova's difficulties with the crown stem not merely from unauthorized trading, but from something more specific that he had encountered somewhere along the routes he was navigating, information or resources that put him in direct conflict with interests considerably more powerful than a routine trading dispute would explain. The Indian Ocean in the early 1500s was not merely a commercial space. It was a strategic one, contested between Portuguese imperial ambitions, established Arab trading networks, and the complex political landscapes of the Indian subcontinent's coastal kingdoms. A commander operating in those waters, with the independence and the local knowledge that de Nova had accumulated, was in a position to know things about routes, about alliances, about the true nature and volume of the trade flowing through particular ports, that the crown might have had reasons to want controlled rather than freely circulated. Whether this speculation has merit is difficult to assess from the surviving evidence. It is the kind of theory that the gaps in the record make possible without the record making it provable. What is perhaps most striking about de Nova's story, viewed from the distance of 5 centuries, is the fleet itself. The ships he commanded, the men who sailed under him, the logs and charts and observations accumulated across multiple Indian Ocean crossings. In the ordinary course of events, some portion of that material would be expected to survive in the Portuguese archives. The Arquivo Nacional de Torre do Tombo in Lisbon holds extraordinary quantities of documentation from the age of exploration: sailing instructions, cargo manifests, correspondence between commanders and the crown, navigational observations that cartographers use to update their understanding of the world's coastlines. De Nova's contribution to that archive is thinner than his career would suggest it should be. The charts he made, if he made them, the observations he recorded, if he recorded them, the accounts of what he found and where and in what condition, these are present in fragments, in references embedded in other documents, in the edges of other men's narratives. The center of his own story, the direct first-hand record of what he saw and did and knew across a decade of Indian Ocean navigation, is largely absent. A man who discovered St. Helena, a discovery significant enough that the island served as a critical waypoint for European navigation for centuries afterward, left behind a documentary footprint that seems, in certain respects, too small for the career it is supposed to represent. Whether that smallness is the ordinary result of time, fire, institutional neglect, and the general entropy that affects all historical archives, or whether it reflects something more deliberate, is a question the archive itself cannot answer. The Indian Ocean keeps its own records, written in current and depth, and the particular way the monsoon moves across the water in the months between seasons. None of it has ever been successfully translated. Archives, as we have seen, can be as eloquent in what they omit as in what they preserve. João de Nova's story thins out at precisely the points where it should be most detailed, leaving a shape that suggests something withheld rather than simply lost. But there is a different kind of archival mystery, one where the record is not thin but severed, where a man exists in the documents with full clarity up to a specific moment and then simply does not appear again, not reduced gradually, not absorbed into bureaucratic obscurity, just gone, as though the record itself flinched. At the bottom of the world, where the Atlantic and the Pacific meet, there is a passage that sailors have feared for 5 centuries with a consistency that speaks to something deeper than professional caution. The Drake Passage, the body of water between the southern tip of South America and the northern edge of Antarctica, is approximately 800 kilometers wide and almost entirely unobstructed by landmass, which means that the Southern Ocean's full fury, driven by winds that circle the globe without interruption, concentrates itself through that gap with a ferocity that has no equivalent anywhere else on Earth. Waves of 20, 30, sometimes 40 meters have been recorded there. The winds are not occasional. They are structural, a permanent feature of the planet's atmospheric system, howling westward around the bottom of the world with the indifference of something that has never been required to care about human navigation. It was into the approaches of this passage that Francisco de Hoces sailed in 1525. And it was there, or somewhere near there, that his story ends. Not cleanly, not dramatically, but in the particular way that the sea ends things when it chooses not to leave evidence. Francisco de Hoces was a Spanish navigator of reasonable experience and established competence, sailing as one of the commanders in the Loaiza expedition of 1525, a fleet dispatched by the Spanish crown to follow the route opened by Magellan 4 years earlier, through the strait at the southern tip of South America and onward to the Spice Islands of the Pacific. The Magellan-Elcano expedition had demonstrated that the route was possible. The Loaiza expedition was intended to demonstrate that it was repeatable and to establish a permanent Spanish presence in the Moluccas before the Portuguese could consolidate their own claim to the region. It was, from nearly the first moment, an expedition in difficulty. The fleet of 7 ships encountered severe weather almost immediately after leaving Spanish waters, losing men and sustaining damage before it had even crossed the Atlantic. By the time the surviving vessels reached the approaches to the Strait of Magellan, the expedition had already paid a significant toll. It was here, in the waters south of the strait, that something happened to de Hoces' ship, the San Lesmes, that has been interpreted in 2 very different ways depending on which documents one reads and how much weight one gives to each. The account preserved in the primary sources is straightforward in its outline. The San Lesmes was separated from the rest of the fleet by a severe storm in the approaches to the strait. De Hoces, driven southward by the storm's force, reportedly found himself in open water further south than any European navigator had yet recorded. Water that appeared to extend without obstruction between the American continent and whatever lay to the south. Whether he understood what he was seeing, whether he recognized that he might be looking at a passage, a gap between continents, rather than simply the chaotic edge of a storm-tossed sea, is not something the surviving record allows us to determine with confidence. He rejoined the fleet. He continued with the expedition into the Strait of Magellan, and then, in the confusion and attrition of an expedition that was consuming ships and men at a devastating rate, the San Lesmes and Francisco de Hoces disappear from the record entirely. The last confirmed reference to the San Lesmes places it in the Pacific, having successfully transited the strait, somewhere in the vicinity of the Moluccas or the broader Western Pacific. After that, nothing. No wreckage was reported, no survivors appeared, no indigenous account from any of the Pacific island groups that might have been in the San Lesmes' path has been conclusively connected to the ship's final voyage. The mainstream explanation is the same one that covers so many of these Pacific disappearances. The ocean is large, the ship was small, the weather was extreme, and wooden vessels of the 16th century were not built to survive indefinitely in waters that challenged even the most robust modern vessels. The San Lesmes most likely sank, in waters too deep and too remote for any trace to have been recovered. But the name attached to the Drake Passage in certain historical contexts is not Drake's alone. Some Spanish and South American historians have argued, with varying degrees of persistence, that Francisco de Hoces saw that passage first, that his storm-driven southern drift in 1525 constituted a prior discovery of the waters that Francis Drake would not encounter until 1578, and that the passage should properly bear de Hoces' name rather than the Englishman who received the credit. In some Spanish-language sources, the passage is still referred to as the Mar de Hoces, the Sea of Hoces. The argument hinges on interpretation. What de Hoces saw during that storm, and whether he understood its geographic significance, is not clearly documented. A navigator driven south by a storm into open water is not necessarily making a discovery in the cartographic sense. He may simply be surviving. Whether de Hoces recorded his observations in a form that was later used by others, lost in the chaos of the expedition's disintegration, or simply never committed to paper at all, is unknown. There is also a theory, quieter and more speculative, that the San Lesmes did not sink in the Pacific approaches to the Moluccas, but traveled much further. That it drifted or sailed eastward across the Pacific and ultimately reached the coast of New Zealand or the islands of Polynesia, where its crew either perished or were absorbed into local populations. Archaeological finds on certain Pacific islands have been examined for European artifacts of 16th century date with suggestive but inconclusive results. The theory remains on the margins of mainstream scholarship, acknowledged but unconfirmed. What is not in dispute is this: a ship left Spain with a crew of men who had names, families, and the ordinary weight of human lives, transited one of the most treacherous passages on Earth, and then continued into an ocean so vast that it simply absorbed them. Francisco de Hoces may have been the first European to glimpse the waters that bear another man's name, or he may have sailed past them into a silence from which nothing has yet returned. The passage still runs between the continents, indifferent to the question of who saw it first. The sea keeps its secrets horizontally, spreading them across distances so vast that absence becomes its own kind of answer. But there is another kind of secret, kept vertically, buried beneath the floors of institutions, locked inside the walls of power, pressed down under the weight of royal authority, until what happened and what was recorded become two different things entirely. Francisco de Hoces vanished into an ocean that offered no witnesses. George Plantagenet died in a place full of them. And somehow, the mystery is no less complete. The Tower of London appears again in this story, as it so often does in the dark passages of English medieval history. Less a building at this point in our exploration than a recurring character. A place with a gravitational pull on the most inconvenient lives of the Plantagenet and early Tudor age. We have already stood within its walls once, contemplating the silence that swallowed two young princes. Now we return to an earlier chapter, and to a death so strange that contemporaries struggled to describe it with straight faces. And historians have been struggling ever since to determine what, beneath the dark absurdity of its surface, actually happened. George Plantagenet, Duke of Clarence, was the middle brother in a family that could not afford excess loyalty. Born in 1449, he was the second surviving son of Richard, Duke of York, which placed him in a position that medieval dynastic politics made inherently unstable. Close enough to the throne to be dangerous, far enough from it to be expendable. His elder brother Edward IV was king. His younger brother Richard, Duke of Gloucester, would eventually become Richard III. George occupied the space between them with an instability that was apparently constitutional as much as political. He changed sides during the Wars of the Roses with a fluidity that his contemporaries found difficult to track, and his brother Edward found increasingly difficult to forgive. He supported the Lancastrian cause against Edward at one point, reconciled with him at another, and was involved in a series of political maneuvers through the 1470s that accumulated into a pattern of behavior that the crown eventually chose to characterize as treasonous. By 1477, his relationship with Edward IV had deteriorated beyond repair. He was arrested, tried before Parliament, in a proceeding where Edward himself reportedly appeared to argue against his own brother, and condemned to death for treason in February of 1478. He was 38 years old. The sentence was death. The method was, by royal tradition, left to some discretion. And here is where the record does something unusual. It becomes simultaneously very specific and very strange. The manner of George's execution, as recorded in multiple contemporary sources, was drowning, specifically drowning in a barrel of Malmsey wine. This detail appears not in one source, but in several, including accounts written close enough to the event to carry some evidential weight. It was noted by contemporaries with varying degrees of discomfort. It was repeated in subsequent chronicles with a persistence that suggests it was not simply invented, and it has been carried forward by historians ever since, treated as established fact by some and as probable embellishment by others, with no definitive resolution ever achieved. The mainstream position is that George was privately executed within the tower, as was standard for condemned nobles whose deaths were not intended as public spectacle, and that the barrel of wine was either the literal method used, chosen perhaps at George's own request as a more dignified or at least more personal end, or a darkly satirical embellishment that attached itself to the story because of George's well-documented fondness for wine, and because the image was too memorably grotesque to be forgotten once it had been imagined. Both possibilities are, in their different ways, unsatisfying. If the barrel story is literally true, it raises questions about who ordered it and why. Private executions of condemned nobles in this period were typically carried out by beheading, efficient, relatively dignified, and consistent with the status of the condemned. Drowning in wine was none of these things. It was theatrical, it was degrading, and it required a specific decision by someone with the authority to depart from normal procedure. That someone was almost certainly Edward IV himself, or someone acting on his very direct instruction. What that choice, if it was made, reveals about the state of feeling between the brothers in those final weeks is not something the record makes explicit. If the barrel story is an embellishment, then the actual method of execution is simply unknown, which creates its own set of questions about why the real method was not recorded or preserved in any surviving document. There are those who have proposed that George did not die by execution at all, that what occurred in the Tower in February 1478 was more complex than a judicial killing, and that the circumstances were obscured precisely because they were embarrassing or incriminating in ways that straightforward execution would not have been. Some researchers have suggested that George may have been offered or may have chosen some form of self-administered death, with the official record reshaped afterward to present the outcome as the result of lawful sentence, rather than something more ambiguous. Others have examined the political context more closely and proposed that the real driving force behind George's condemnation was not Edward himself, but the Woodvilles, the family of Edward's queen, Elizabeth Woodville, who had their own reasons to regard George as a threat, and who had the king's ear in ways that George, by 1477, demonstrably did not. In this reading, George's death was less a royal decision than a factional one, with Edward providing the legal mechanism for an outcome that others had determined and engineered. There is also a question about what George knew, or claimed to know. In the period leading up to his arrest, he had been making accusations that touched on the legitimacy of Edward's marriage and, by extension, the legitimacy of Edward's children. These were not minor allegations. They struck at the foundation of the succession. Whether George had genuine evidence, whether he was simply engaging in reckless political agitation, or whether he had stumbled onto something that powerful people needed silenced, that question sits unresolved at the center of his story. A man condemned by his own brother, executed by a method so bizarre that 5 centuries of historians have debated whether to take it literally, in a building that has swallowed more inconvenient truths than perhaps any other structure in English history. The wine, the barrel, the brother, and the silence that followed. What exactly died in the Tower that February evening is a question the record raises and declines to fully answer. Power, as we have seen, disposes of inconvenient people with a variety of methods, some violent, some institutional, some so subtle that the record itself becomes the instrument of concealment. George Plantagenet died in circumstances strange enough to generate 5 centuries of debate. But there is another kind of inconvenience that power manages differently, not by silencing a person, but by allowing them to speak freely, prolifically, and at great length, while ensuring that the most important things they might say remain, somehow, perpetually, just out of reach. Sebastian Cabot spent the better part of a long life talking about his voyages, and the more he talked, the less, in certain crucial respects, anyone could be sure of what he had actually done. Bristol, in the early 16th century, was England's western gateway to the Atlantic, a port city with a tradition of maritime enterprise that predated Columbus and would outlast the age of exploration by centuries. Its merchants had been funding speculative westward voyages since at least the 1480s, searching for Atlantic fishing grounds and, perhaps, for something more. It was from Bristol that John Cabot, Giovanni Caboto, a Venetian navigator in English service, had sailed in 1497, making landfall somewhere on the North American coast in the first confirmed English contact with the continent. He returned to Bristol a modest celebrity, rewarded by Henry VII, and promptly sailed again in 1498, after which he disappeared from the record entirely and is presumed to have died at sea. John Cabot left behind, among other things, a son. Sebastian Cabot is one of the most frustrating figures in the history of exploration, not because he is obscure, but because he is abundant. He lived to a considerable age, worked as a navigator and cartographer across an exceptionally long career, served the crowns of both England and Spain at different points in his life, and talked about his experiences with a fluency and apparent openness that generated extensive documentation. He was interviewed, consulted, deposed, and quoted across decades. And yet the central question about his career, what he actually discovered, and when and where, remains, after 5 centuries of historical examination, genuinely unresolved. The core of the mystery concerns a voyage, or possibly several voyages, that Sebastian claimed to have made to North America in the first decade of the 16th century. His accounts of these voyages, given at various points in his long life, describe explorations of the North American coastline that were, if accurate, among the most extensive of the early exploration period, reaching, in some versions of his telling, as far south as Florida and as far north as the Arctic approaches of what we now call Hudson Bay. He claimed to have found a passage, or the approaches to a passage, that might lead westward to Asia, the Northwest Passage that navigators would spend the next 3 centuries searching for. These were extraordinary claims. They were also claims that the documentary record does not straightforwardly support. The English royal archives from the relevant period, the early years of Henry VII's reign transitioning into Henry VIII's, contain references to Cabot voyages and payments that are tantalizingly incomplete. There are records of preparations, of funding discussions, of permissions granted. There is not in the surviving English archive a clear and comprehensive account of what those voyages actually found, written contemporaneously and by a reliable independent witness. What exists instead is Sebastian's own testimony, given years and sometimes decades after the events he was describing, to audiences who had reasons of their own to be interested in what he claimed to know. When Sebastian described his northern voyages to Spanish officials during the years he served the Spanish crown, he was doing so in a context where his value to Spain depended partly on what geographic knowledge he could offer. When he described them to English merchants and officials later in his career, when he had returned to English service and was helping to organize the Muscovy Company's search for a northeastern passage to Asia, the same dynamic applied. A man whose professional value depended on possessing unique geographic knowledge had structural incentives to present that knowledge in the most impressive possible light. Historians have been navigating this problem with Sebastian Cabot for as long as they have been studying him. The more troubling questions concern not whether Sebastian exaggerated, but whether he concealed. There are suggestions in the record, fragmentary, resistant to definitive interpretation, that Sebastian possessed cartographic information about the North American coastline that went beyond what his documented voyages could account for. His maps, of which surviving examples exist, show features and details that have generated sustained scholarly debate about their sources. Some of those features correspond with what his claimed early voyages would have produced, if those voyages were as extensive as he claimed. Others are less easily explained. There is also the matter of Sebastian's relationship with his father's legacy. John Cabot's 1497 voyage was, by the early 16th century, recognized as historically significant, the basis for English territorial claims in North America. Sebastian, in his later accounts, had a habit of describing his early voyages in ways that occasionally blurred the line between what he had done and what his father had done, sometimes appearing to claim his father's discoveries as his own, or to position himself as the primary actor in expeditions where other evidence suggests he played a secondary role at best. Whether this represented deliberate appropriation, the natural drift of memory across decades, or a more complex and perhaps unconscious reconstruction of a past that Sebastian had reasons to reshape, Historians disagree. What is clear is that by the time Sebastian was old enough and prominent enough for his accounts to be extensively recorded, the people who could have corrected or contradicted him were largely dead. He outlived his contemporaries with what seems, in retrospect, like a convenient thoroughness. In his final years, Sebastian Cabot was a respected and well-compensated figure in English maritime circles, consulted, honored, and listened to with an attention that his documented achievements, viewed strictly, might not entirely justify. He died around 1557, taking with him whatever gap existed between what he had claimed and what he had actually done. The charts he made have been analyzed. The accounts he gave have been cross-referenced. The archives of England, Spain, and Venice have been searched for corroborating documentation. And the precise shape of what Sebastian Cabot actually saw in those early years when the North American coastline was still being encountered for the first time by European eyes remains one of the quieter, unsolved questions of the age of exploration. He spoke at length. He spoke often. And somehow, the more he said, the less certain anyone could be of exactly what he meant. Sebastian Cabot understood, perhaps better than anyone in his generation, that the value of what you know depends entirely on controlling who else knows it. He managed his geographic knowledge like a careful merchant manages inventory, releasing enough to maintain credibility, withholding enough to maintain indispensability. But there were others in this same era who possessed knowledge of the Western and Northern Atlantic that has been even more thoroughly lost. Not through careful management, but through the simpler and more brutal mechanism of simply ceasing to exist in the record. Hans Pothorst is one of those figures, and his disappearance, when examined closely, opens onto questions that reach considerably further than the fate of one German sailor. The North Atlantic in the late 15th century was not the unknown void that popular imagination sometimes makes it. The fishing grounds off Iceland had been worked by English, German, and Scandinavian vessels for generations. The Hanseatic merchants who dominated northern European trade had been sending ships into those waters long before Columbus made his celebrated crossing, and their sailors had accumulated practical knowledge of Atlantic navigation that was rarely committed to formal documents because it did not need to be. It lived in the hands and memories of experienced seamen, passed between crews at the docks of Bergen and Bristol and Hamburg with the informal efficiency of professional knowledge in any trade. Hans Pothorst operated in this world. He was a German, specifically by most accounts from Hamburg or its surrounding region, and by the 1470s he had established himself as a navigator of sufficient reputation to attract the attention of the Danish crown. This was not a minor distinction. Denmark in this period controlled not only its own considerable coastline, but also the approaches to Iceland, Greenland, and the broader North Atlantic, and the Crown had both commercial and territorial interests in maintaining effective navigation through those waters. In 1476, Pothorst sailed on what has become, in retrospect, one of the most obscure and contested voyages of the pre-Columbian period. He was one of the commanders, sailing alongside a man named Diedrich Pining, a Danish captain of significant reputation, of an expedition dispatched by the Danish king Christian I, apparently at the request of the King of Portugal, João II. The destination was the waters to the west and northwest of Iceland. The precise objective of the voyage is not clearly stated in any surviving primary source, which is itself the first and perhaps most fundamental problem in understanding what Pothorst and Pining actually did. What we know comes largely from a single document, a letter written decades after the voyage, in 1551, by the mayor of the German city of Kiel, addressed to the King of Portugal. This letter, which surfaced in historical scholarship in the 19th century, describes the 1476 voyage in terms that are striking in their implications. It refers to Pining and Pothorst as having discovered, or revisited, lands to the west. Lands that some historians have interpreted as a reference to the North American continent, or at minimum to Greenland and the waters beyond it, in the years before Columbus. If this interpretation is correct, and it is contested, then Hans Pothorst may have been among the first Europeans of his era to make documented contact with the western Atlantic coastline. The implications for the history of exploration would be considerable, though not necessarily revolutionary, given what we already know about Norse voyages to North America 5 centuries earlier. But the letter is a single source, written by someone who was not present on the voyage, recording events that had occurred 75 years before the letter was written. Its reliability is, by the standards of historical evidence, limited. And what makes Pothorst's story genuinely strange is not the contested question of what he found, but the question of what happened to him afterward. After the 1476 voyage, Pothorst appears in the documentary record only intermittently, and with a thinness that is difficult to account for given what appears to have been a significant career. There are references to him in Danish and Hanseatic commercial records from the period, enough to establish that he continued operating in the North Atlantic trade into the 1480s, that he maintained some form of ongoing relationship with both the Danish crown and the Northern Atlantic fishing and trading networks, and that he was regarded, by those who dealt with him professionally, as someone of substance and experience. And then, at some point in the late 1480s or early 1490s, the exact date is not recorded, which is itself part of the problem, he disappears. Not dramatically. Not with the clean finality of a ship lost in a storm, where at least the absence is noted and its approximate cause assigned. He simply stops appearing in documents. The references cease. The name drops out of the correspondence and commercial records that had previously, however sparsely, contained it. This kind of disappearance from the historical record is not, in itself, unusual for a 15th century sailor of non-noble birth. The documentation of ordinary maritime careers in this period is fragmentary at best, and the absence of a name from surviving records can reflect nothing more consequential than the ordinary losses of time. Documents not preserved, records not kept, archives destroyed by fire or flood or institutional neglect across 5 centuries. But in Pothorst's case, the timing of the disappearance has attracted attention. If the 1476 voyage did reach, or approach, the Western Atlantic in ways that carried genuine geographic significance, then Pothorst was one of a very small number of people alive in the late 15th century who possessed first-hand knowledge of those waters from personal experience. That knowledge would have had value, commercial, strategic, and navigational, to any number of parties actively interested in the question of what lay to the west. Columbus made his first Atlantic crossing in 1492. The precise sources of Columbus's geographic thinking, what convinced him that a western route to Asia was viable, what information he had about the Atlantic beyond the documented scholarship of his era, has been a subject of sustained historical debate for centuries. Among the threads that researchers have occasionally pulled is the question of whether Columbus had access, directly or indirectly, to knowledge accumulated by pre-Columbian Atlantic voyagers, including, potentially, the kind of practical navigational knowledge that a sailor like Pothorst would have possessed. No direct connection between Columbus and Pothorst has been established. The documentary evidence for such a connection does not exist in any surviving source, but the circumstantial geography is not without interest. Columbus was in Lisbon and the Iberian Peninsula during a period when the Portuguese crown was actively collecting geographic intelligence about the Atlantic, and the 1476 Pining Pothorst voyage had been conducted at least partly at Portuguese royal request. What passed between the various parties interested in Atlantic navigation during the 1480s, in the years when Columbus was developing his project and seeking royal support for it, is not fully documented anywhere. Knowledge moved through informal channels, through conversations at docks and in merchant houses, through the professional networks of navigators who worked across national boundaries as readily as the winds carried them. Whether Pothorst's knowledge was part of that circulation, and whether it reached anyone whose subsequent actions we can trace, is a question the record cannot currently answer. There are those who have proposed that Pothorst did not simply fade from the record through natural causes, but was, in some more active sense, removed from it. That knowledge of the Western Atlantic was being managed carefully by the Portuguese crown, and that individuals who possessed it independently, outside royal control, represented a complication that the crown had both the motivation and the means to address. This is a speculative argument, and it should be clearly understood as such. It rests on inference and circumstantial reasoning rather than documentary evidence. What gives it a certain gravity, however, is the broader pattern that emerges when one looks at the fate of pre-Columbian Atlantic knowledge more generally. The Portuguese were systematic about controlling geographic intelligence. Their policy of secrecy regarding navigation routes and discoveries was explicit and enforced. Pilots who sailed on royal expeditions signed agreements restricting what they could share. Maps were classified. The penalty for unauthorized disclosure of navigational secrets could be severe. In that environment, an independent navigator who had sailed into waters the Portuguese crown regarded as strategically sensitive, and who owed his primary loyalty to Danish rather than Portuguese interests, was a particular kind of problem. Whether that problem was managed through formal means, informal pressure, or simply through the passage of time and the ordinary attrition of a hard profession, the outcome was the same. By the time Columbus returned from his first voyage in 1493, and the Atlantic became, suddenly and irrevocably, the most important geographic space in the world, Hans Pothorst was no longer present to offer any account of what he had seen there 17 years earlier. The waters he sailed still exist, of course. The gray, cold stretches of the North Atlantic between Iceland and the approaches to the northwest, where the light in summer barely sets and the sea has a metallic quality that makes distances impossible to judge. Ships still pass through them, though with instruments and charts that would have been unimaginable to a Hamburg navigator in the 1470s. Whatever Pothorst saw out there, whatever he understood about the shape of the waters beyond the known edge, whatever he might have said if anyone had been in a position to listen and record, it went with him. And the North Atlantic, as it has always done, absorbed the silence without comment. The North Atlantic keeps its secrets in water and weather in the absence of witnesses. But some secrets are kept differently, not in the vastness of open ocean, but in something small enough to hold in two hands. Something that sits quietly on a shelf, waiting, in a language that no one alive has ever been able to read. Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library at Yale University is not a dramatic building from the outside. It is modernist, precise, its exterior walls made of translucent marble panels that filter the light in a way that feels deliberate, as though the building itself is meditating on the relationship between illumination and opacity. Inside, behind climate-controlled glass, among thousands of remarkable objects accumulated across centuries of scholarship and acquisition, sits a book that has occupied the attention of cryptographers, linguists, historians, botanists, astronomers, and theorists of every conceivable persuasion for over 100 years. It is approximately 23 centimeters tall. It contains around 240 pages, though evidence suggests pages are missing. It is written in an ink that has been carbon dated to the early 15th century, most likely between 1404 and 1438. It is illustrated throughout with images of plants that do not correspond to any known species, astronomical diagrams of uncertain meaning, figures of nude women bathing in green liquid connected by elaborate tubular systems, and what appear to be pharmaceutical or alchemical preparations whose purpose cannot be determined. Every word of its text, and there are tens of thousands of them, is written in a script that no one has successfully deciphered. In over a century of sustained, serious, technically sophisticated effort, the Voynich manuscript has not yielded a single confirmed translated sentence. Its author is unknown. The manuscript takes its name from Wilfrid Voynich, a Polish antiquarian bookseller who acquired it in 1912 from the Jesuit college at Villa Mondragone near Rome. Voynich recognized immediately that he had something extraordinary and spent much of the remainder of his life attempting to establish its provenance and decode its contents. He succeeded at neither. What he did find, tucked inside the manuscript, was a letter dated 1666, written by Johannes Marcus Marci, a rector of Prague University, to the famous Jesuit scholar Athanasius Kircher. The letter accompanied the manuscript, which Marci was sending to Kircher in the hope that Kircher, one of the most learned men in Europe, might be able to decode it. Marci's letter mentioned that the manuscript had previously been owned by Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph II, who had reportedly paid 600 ducats for it. an enormous sum that indicates the manuscript was regarded in the late 16th century as something of extraordinary value or significance. Kircher, for all his formidable learning, apparently could not decode it either. Or if he could, he left no record of having done so. Rudolf II's ownership takes the manuscript's traceable history back to the late 16th century. The carbon dating of the vellum takes its physical existence back to the early 15th century. Between those 2 points, roughly 1420 and 1580, the manuscript's location and ownership are unknown. This gap of approximately a century and a half is where, for many researchers, the most interesting questions live. The central mystery is not simply what the manuscript says, but who wrote it, why, and in what context. These questions are inseparable from each other. Understanding the author would illuminate the purpose. Understanding the purpose would illuminate the text, and understanding the text, if it is decipherable at all, would presumably illuminate everything else. The candidates that scholars have proposed for authorship span an almost comically wide range. Roger Bacon, the 13th century English friar and proto-scientist, was Voynich's own preferred candidate, a man whose interest in natural philosophy, optics, and what might broadly be called experimental knowledge made him an appealing match for a manuscript that appeared to blend botanical, astronomical, and alchemical concerns. The carbon dating of the vellum has largely ruled out Bacon, who died in 1292, though defenders of the Bacon hypothesis have argued that the manuscript could be a 15th century copy of an earlier original. John Dee, the Elizabethan mathematician, astrologer, and self-described communicant with angels, has been proposed on the grounds of his presence in Rudolf II's Prague and his documented interest in cryptography and esoteric knowledge. Edward Kelly, Dee's associate and alleged medium, has been suggested independently. Both men were in the right place, at the right time, with the right combination of interests and capabilities to have produced something like the Voynich manuscript. And both were, by any reasonable assessment, capable of elaborate intellectual constructions that blurred the line between genuine inquiry and sophisticated mystification. Anthony Ascham, an English herbalist of the 15th century, has been proposed on botanical grounds. Raphael Mniszowski, a 17th century Bohemian lawyer mentioned in Marcy's letter as a possible candidate, has been examined and largely set aside. Various Italian humanists, Catalan scholars, and Central European alchemists have been put forward and subjected to varying degrees of serious analysis. None has been confirmed. None has been definitively ruled out. The linguistic analysis of the Voynich text has generated its own parallel controversy, distinct from but related to the question of authorship. The text displays statistical properties consistent with natural language, word frequency distributions, positional patterns, the clustering of certain letter combinations that have convinced most serious analysts that it is not simply random. Something structured is being encoded. The question is, what? Proposed decipherments have been put forward periodically, with varying degrees of credibility, and none has achieved scholarly consensus. Some researchers have proposed that the text represents a known language written in an invented script, Latin, Arabic, Hebrew, an early form of a European vernacular, encoded through a cipher or substitution system. Others have proposed that it represents a constructed language, invented specifically for the manuscript, which would explain why no correspondence with known linguistic structures has been established. A smaller number have proposed that the text is a deliberate hoax, a sophisticated fake designed to appear meaningful without actually encoding anything, though the statistical complexity of the text makes this explanation increasingly difficult to sustain. The botanical illustrations deserve their own attention because they represent perhaps the most practically accessible dimension of the manuscript and yet remain as unresolved as everything else. Botanists have examined the plant illustrations exhaustively, attempting to match them with known species. Some illustrations are suggestive of real plants, a few have been tentatively identified with varying degrees of confidence, but the majority depict flora that does not correspond to any known plant in any known botanical tradition. They are not obviously stylized versions of real plants in the way that medieval herbal illustrations sometimes abstract their subjects. They appear, to many analysts, to be genuinely invented, or to represent plants observed in conditions or locations that produce specimens unlike anything in the European or Near Eastern botanical record. This observation has generated one of the more intriguing fringe theories attached to the manuscript, that the plants depicted are from the New World, and that the manuscript's author had access, directly or through intermediaries, to botanical knowledge of the Americas that was not yet in general European circulation. The early 15th century dating would make this impossible in the straightforward sense, since sustained European contact with the Americas began after 1492. But if the manuscript is a later copy, or if the carbon dating reflects only the vellum and not the date of composition, the New World hypothesis remains at minimum, not impossible. The astronomical and cosmological diagrams present their own difficulties. Some appear to show zodiacal arrangements, others what might be planetary systems, others circular designs whose reference system has not been identified. Several appear to show the Pleiades star cluster, drawn in a way that some researchers find consistent with early 15th century astronomical illustration, and others find anomalous. The bathing women, connected by their elaborate network of tubes and pools, have resisted interpretation most stubbornly of all. Medical, alchemical, symbolic, cosmological. Every proposal has been made. None has been established. What the manuscript does with remarkable consistency is remain just at the edge of comprehension, close enough to familiar categories of knowledge that analysis feels productive, far enough outside them that no analysis has yet broken through. Whether this quality is inherent in the content, a feature of the encoding system, or a deliberate design choice by an author who understood exactly how to position a text at the boundary between legibility and mystery, that question cannot be answered without first establishing who the author was. And there is where everything circles back to the same silence. Someone in the early 15th century, or possibly later, or possibly working from earlier materials, sat down with vellum, ink, and intention, and produced one of the most thoroughly examined and least understood documents in the history of human writing. They illustrated it with care. They wrote it in a consistent hand. They organized it into what appeared to be thematic sections. They bound it and, at some point, released it into the world. They left no name, no colophon, no marginal note in a known language that might provide a foothold. The book sits in New Haven, in its controlled environment, behind its glass. It has been waiting for over 600 years to be understood. So far, it has been more patient than anyone trying to read it. The Voynich manuscript has waited 6 centuries for someone to read it. Its author concealed themselves behind a script that has defeated every attempt at penetration, leaving a presence that is simultaneously overwhelming. The book exists, undeniably, in all its elaborate detail, and completely absent. We know someone was there. We cannot find them. But the Voynich represents a particular kind of concealment, the kind that operates through complexity, through the layering of meaning behind meaning until the original signal disappears entirely. There is another kind of concealment, simpler, more direct, more human in its brutality, the kind that operates not through coded language, but through locked doors, transferred prisoners, and the systematic erasure of identity from official record. The kind practiced by states when they encounter a person who, for reasons they are unwilling to commit to paper, must exist but must not be known. The Man in the Iron Mask is one of the most famous mysteries in French history. The unnamed prisoner who spent decades in various royal fortresses, whose face was concealed behind a mask described in some accounts as iron and in others as black velvet, who died in the Bastille in 1703 under a false name, and whose identity Voltaire and Alexandre Dumas later transformed into legend. But the famous prisoner of Louis XIV's reign did not emerge from nowhere. He was the product of a system, a specific institutional practice of maintaining high-value prisoners in conditions of enforced anonymity that had precursors. Earlier prisoners, Earlier masks, earlier erasures that established the template the Iron Mask would later inhabit so dramatically. Understanding those precursors is not simply an exercise in historical completeness. It is the only way to understand why the practice existed, what it was designed to achieve, and what the people who designed it were afraid of. The Bastille itself requires a moment's attention before the prisoners inside it can be understood. It was not, in the popular imagination's version of it, primarily a dungeon. It was a state prison, a place where individuals were held not through the ordinary machinery of criminal justice, but by lettre de cachet, a royal order that bypassed the courts entirely, required no stated charge, and could be issued at the king's pleasure, or, in practice, at the pleasure of those who had the king's ear. The lettre de cachet was a tool of administrative convenience that the French monarchy had been refining since the 16th century, and its distinguishing feature, the feature that made it both enormously useful and deeply sinister, was that it operated outside public accountability. The prisoner it dispatched to the Bastille had no trial, no formal accusation, no legal avenue of appeal, and in some cases no officially acknowledged existence. This last possibility, the prisoner who is not officially there, is where the precursors to the Iron Mask begin to appear. The practice of concealing a prisoner's identity, rather than simply confining them, requires a specific set of conditions. The prisoner must be recognizable. Their face or their name must mean something to people who might otherwise be encountered in the normal course of a prison's operation: guards, chaplains, physicians, servants, other prisoners. The state must have reasons for keeping them alive that outweigh the simpler solution of simply killing them. And the reasons for their confinement must be sufficiently sensitive that even the act of naming them as prisoners carries risks the state is unwilling to accept. These conditions were not common. They required a particular kind of prisoner, someone whose identity was itself the dangerous thing, whose mere acknowledged existence in state custody would generate questions the state could not safely answer. The 16th and early 17th centuries produced several figures who sat in this particular category, though the documentation surrounding them is, by the nature of the practice, deliberately incomplete. One of the most carefully examined precursors is the case of prisoners held during the religious wars that tore France apart in the latter half of the 16th century, a period of extraordinary violence, factional complexity, and political calculation in which the French crown found itself repeatedly in possession of individuals whose public acknowledgement as prisoners would have inflamed one or another of the factions whose cooperation the crown needed to manage. The Huguenot leaders who periodically found themselves in royal custody, the Catholic League commanders whose imprisonment or release was a matter of delicate negotiation, the Italian intermediaries who moved between the Valois court and various foreign powers, all existed in a landscape where the formal acknowledgement of their status as prisoners could upset balances that the crown was working to maintain. Most of these cases were resolved through negotiation, release, or death in ways that left at least some documentary trace. But the edges of the record contain figures who are harder to place, individuals referred to in correspondence by circumlocution rather than name, prisoners described by their function or their origin rather than their identity, people whose presence in certain facilities can be inferred from administrative records without those records ever committing the politically sensitive act of naming them. The reign of Cardinal Richelieu, from 1624 to 1642, represents a particular intensification of this practice. Richelieu was, among his many other attributes, a systematic administrator who understood the political uses of imprisonment with unusual sophistication. Under his direction, the lettre de cachet became a more refined instrument, issued more strategically, managed more carefully, and increasingly deployed in cases where the political sensitivity of the prisoner required active management of information rather than simply confinement of the person. Among the prisoners whose cases researchers have examined as precursors to the Iron Mask phenomenon is a figure referred to in certain Richelieu-era documents only as the Italian, a prisoner held in conditions of unusual restriction at one of the royal fortresses in the 1630s, whose real name does not appear in any surviving official document from the period, and whose presence can only be established through the administrative paperwork generated by his confinement. The orders for his food, his accommodation, his supervision, none of which identify him by name. The reason for his imprisonment, the nature of what made him dangerous to name, and his eventual fate are all absent from the surviving record. Whether the omission is deliberate or the result of archive loss is precisely the question the archive cannot answer. Closer to the Iron Mask's own period, researchers have identified several prisoners held under the administration of the Superintendent of Fortresses in the 1660s and 1670s, whose files show unusual features. Transfer orders written in language that circumvents the normal administrative requirement to name the prisoner, instructions to jailers regarding the maintenance of silence around a particular prisoner that go beyond standard security protocols, and in at least 2 cases, records that appear to have been deliberately redacted or removed from the archival sequence in ways that post-date the original filing. The question these precursors raise is not simply historical. It is structural. A state that develops the practice of maintaining unnamed prisoners whose identities are considered dangerous enough to conceal even within official documentation, has created an institutional infrastructure that can be applied across multiple cases. The Iron Mask in this reading was not an anomaly. He was a sophisticated deployment of a practice that had been developing for over a century, refined through earlier cases, managed by administrators who knew what they were doing because they had done versions of it before. This reframing shifts the question in an important direction. The traditional approach to the Iron Mask mystery focuses on identifying the specific individual behind the mask. And the candidates are numerous, ranging from a twin brother of Louis XIV to various Italian nobles to a disgraced diplomat named Eustache Dauger, who remains the most academically favored candidate. But the precursor research suggests that the more fundamental question may not be who the prisoner was, but why the system that produced his particular form of concealment existed in the first place, and what it was consistently used to hide. The cases that precede the Iron Mask share certain features worth noting. They tend to involve individuals with connections to more than one European power, people whose acknowledged imprisonment could have triggered diplomatic complications. They tend to involve information rather than action, prisoners who knew things rather than prisoners who had done things. And they tend to cluster around moments of political transition, when the incoming administration had reasons to manage the legacy of its predecessor in ways that the formal record could not acknowledge. Louis XIV's administration did not invent the masked prisoner. It inherited a tradition, refined it, and applied it to a case whose particulars were sensitive enough to require the most thorough version of the concealment. A physical mask, a false name maintained through death and burial, official documentation that is yielded after 3 centuries of examination, no confirmed identification. What the precursor cases suggest is that the Iron Mask was not a unique improvisation, but a practiced solution to a recurring problem. The problem of what to do with a person whose existence is simultaneously necessary and impossible. Necessary to keep alive, impossible to acknowledge. The cells that held those earlier, unnamed prisoners are mostly gone now. The fortresses have been demolished or converted, their stones repurposed, their records scattered across archives that have been reorganized and catalogued and partially lost across 4 centuries of French history. What remains is the shape of the practice, visible in the gaps, in the circumlocutions, in the administrative paperwork that mentions a prisoner without naming him, in the transfer orders that describe a person by his problem rather than his identity. Someone was there. The record confirms the confinement while refusing to confirm the person. And in that refusal, maintained so carefully across so many cases and so many decades, one begins to sense the outline of something that the French state understood very clearly and was never, under any circumstances, willing to say out loud. The French state concealed its most dangerous prisoners behind locked doors and false names, maintaining institutional silence through administrative precision. The concealment was deliberate, systematic, and enforced. But there is another kind of concealment that operates differently, not through state power and locked cells, but through the nature of art itself. Through the decision, conscious or otherwise, to encode a real person inside a fictional form, to transform a living individual into a literary construct, and to release that construct into the world while the original remains hidden behind it, protected by the very beauty of the thing that reveals them. This is what makes the Dark Lady of Shakespeare's sonnets one of the most persistently fascinating identity puzzles in literary history. Not simply that we do not know who she was, though we do not, but that we are not entirely certain she was one person at all, and that the tradition of encoding real figures inside literary form that the sonnets participate in has roots that reach back through decades of Elizabethan literary culture, creating a complex of precedents and parallels that makes the Dark Lady mystery both more tractable and more complicated than it first appears. The sonnets were published in 1609, though many were almost certainly written years or decades earlier. The collection of 154 poems falls into loose groupings that scholars have organized around three figures: a beautiful young man addressed in the first 126 sonnets, a rival poet who appears in a smaller cluster, and the Dark Lady, who occupies sonnets 127 through 152. She is described with a consistency that suggests a specific rather than an invented person. Dark hair, dark eyes, dark complexion, a musical ability, and a personality that the sonnets treat with a kind of anguished ambivalence, desire, and self-reproach and admiration and bitterness, wound together in ways that feel less like literary convention and more like the confused texture of an actual relationship. She is not idealized. This is, in itself, significant. The Petrarchan tradition that dominated European love poetry in the 16th century dealt in idealized, distant, physically conventional women. Fair-skinned, golden-haired, emotionally inaccessible. The Dark Lady violates nearly every convention of that tradition, and does so in ways that feel deliberate. Shakespeare is not simply describing a woman. He appears to be describing a particular woman against a backdrop of literary conventions that her particularity disrupts. But to understand why identifying her has proved so difficult, and why the question of precursors matters, it is necessary to understand something about the literary culture of Elizabethan London that is easy to overlook from a distance of 4 centuries. The sonnet sequences of the 1580s and 1590s, Sidney's Astrophil and Stella, Spenser's Amoretti, Daniel's Delia, Lodge's Phyllis, and dozens of others, were not purely fictional constructions. They participated in a complex social practice in which real relationships, real people, and real court dynamics were encoded into literary form and circulated among audiences who were expected, at least in part, to recognize the encoded figures. This was not a hidden practice. It was understood, discussed, and in some cases explicitly acknowledged in the prefatory materials that accompanied published sequences. Philip Sidney's Astrophil and Stella, published posthumously in 1591 and almost universally understood by contemporaries to concern Sidney's relationship with Penelope Devereux, later Lady Rich, represents the most prominent example of this practice. Sidney did not name Penelope Devereux in the sequence. He encoded her, most explicitly in a sonnet that plays on her married name, in a way that would have been immediately recognizable to anyone in the relevant social circle. The encoding was thin enough to be transparent to insiders while providing the deniability that social convention required. This practice, encoding real figures in literary form with a degree of transparency calibrated to the intended audience, is the tradition within which Shakespeare's sonnets must be understood. The Dark Lady, in this context, was almost certainly recognizable to some part of Shakespeare's original audience. The question of why she has not remained recognizable across 4 centuries is the question that the precursor tradition helps to illuminate. The answer, in part, is social geography. Sidney's Penelope Devereux was a figure of the court, highly visible, extensively documented, connected to networks of correspondence and record-keeping that have preserved her identity across the centuries. The women encoded in other Elizabethan sonnet sequences tend to share this characteristic. They are women of sufficient social standing to appear in the documentary record, which means that the encoding can be reconstructed by later scholars working from surviving evidence. The Dark Lady, by contrast, appears to be someone whose social position was different. Not a figure of the court in the way that Penelope Devereux was, not connected to the documentary networks that preserve aristocratic women across centuries. Whatever her identity, she seems to have inhabited a social space that left fewer traces, which is itself a clue, though an ambiguous one. The candidates that researchers have proposed for the Dark Lady's identity reflect the uncertainty about her social position. Emilia Bassano, later Emilia Lanier, is the most thoroughly argued candidate in recent scholarship, a woman of Italian Jewish heritage, a musician, connected to the court through her position as mistress of the Lord Chamberlain Henry Carey, and one of the first women in England to publish a volume of poetry. She has dark complexion noted in available records. She was musical. She moved in circles that overlapped with Shakespeare's in ways that are documentable. The case for Emilia Lanier, assembled most prominently by the scholar A.L. Rouse in the 1970s and subsequently revised and elaborated by others, is the most specific and evidence-grounded of the Dark Lady proposals. It is also not universally accepted. The connections between Lanier and Shakespeare, while suggestive, rest on inference and circumstantial proximity rather than any direct documented relationship. The parallels between Lanier's biography and the Dark Lady's described characteristics are real, but not unique. Other women in Shakespeare's London shared similar profiles, and the documentary record is incomplete enough that the absence of other candidates may reflect archive gaps rather than their actual non-existence. Mary Fitton, a maid of honor to Queen Elizabeth, was an earlier candidate, proposed in the late 19th century on the grounds of her known romantic history and her documented connection to Shakespeare's patron, the Earl of Pembroke. The discovery of a portrait that suggested she was fair rather than dark undermined the case considerably, though defenders have argued about the portrait's reliability. Lucy Morgan, also known as Black Luce, a woman of African heritage who ran a brothel in Clerkenwell and is mentioned in several Elizabethan documents, has been proposed on the grounds of her documented association with the theater world and the explicit darkness of her complexion. The evidence connecting her specifically to Shakespeare is thin, but she represents a category of candidate, women of non-European heritage present in Elizabethan London, that the documentary record has made difficult to trace, and that earlier scholarship tended to overlook. This last point connects back to the precursor tradition in an important way. The Elizabethan literary encoding of real women was, as practiced by Sidney and his contemporaries, primarily an aristocratic activity. It encoded aristocratic women for aristocratic audiences, in a social world where the relevant parties were sufficiently documented to remain reconstructible. Shakespeare's sonnets appear to encode someone who sat outside that world, or at its margins, in a social space where women were less systematically documented and their identities correspondingly harder to recover. The precursors to the Dark Lady in this reading are not other literary characters, but other real women. The women encoded by Sidney's contemporaries, whose identities have been successfully recovered precisely because their social position generated sufficient documentation. The Dark Lady's continued anonymity may be less a function of deliberate concealment than of the ordinary archival consequence of gender, class, and the uneven survival of records across 4 centuries. There is a smaller scholarly tradition that approaches the Dark Lady question from a different angle entirely, proposing that she is not a single individual, but a composite, a literary construction assembled from multiple real figures or from a combination of real observation and conventional trope. This argument has the advantage of explaining why no single candidate fits every detail of the sequence perfectly. It has the disadvantage of collapsing a specific literary mystery into a general observation about the nature of literary character that feels, to many readers, like a less interesting answer than the question deserves. Because the sonnets do not feel composite. They feel specific. The anguish in them feels particular. The relationship they describe, its contradictions, its self-awareness, its persistent quality of being unable to end cleanly, reads like something that happened to someone, not something assembled from component parts. Whoever she was, she inspired 154 poems from one of the greatest writers the English language has produced. She was encoded into art with enough care and enough ambivalence that the encoding has lasted 4 centuries and generated more scholarly attention than most historical figures receive. And she has remained, despite all of it, unnamed. The sonnets are in every library. Her identity is in none of them. Somewhere in the gap between those two facts, a real person waits. Patient, dark-eyed, and still, after all this time, unknown. Some people remain unknown despite being the subject of extraordinary attention. The dark lady encoded in plain sight, present in every library and absent from every archive. But there is another category of historical mystery, in some ways the inverse of that one, where the people involved are extensively documented, their names preserved, their deaths recorded. And yet the consequences of what happened to them ripple forward through generations in ways that remain, even now, incompletely traced. Where the mystery is not who they were, but what their disappearance set in motion, and whether the claims made in its wake have any foundation that surviving evidence can support. The English Channel on a November night is not a place that forgives mistakes. It is cold, dark, and, in the waters off the Normandy coast near Barfleur, studded with rocks that have been claimed by charts and marked by experience across centuries of maritime traffic. In November of 1120, those rocks were not yet fully charted, the night was dark, and the crew of the White Ship were, by multiple contemporary accounts, significantly drunk. The White Ship was the finest vessel in the English Royal Fleet, new, fast, and crewed by the most experienced sailors available. It had been offered to King Henry I of England for the crossing from Normandy back to England, but Henry had already departed on another vessel. The White Ship carried instead the flower of Anglo-Norman aristocracy, young men and women of the highest families in England and Normandy, traveling home after the court's extended stay in France. Most importantly, it carried William Adelin, the only legitimate son of Henry I, heir to the English throne, 17 years old and recently married. The ship struck the rock called Quillebeuf shortly after leaving Barfleur Harbor. It sank within minutes. Of the estimated 300 people aboard, one man survived, a butcher from Rouen named Barold, who clung to wreckage through the night and was pulled from the water the following morning. William Adelin drowned. So did his half-sister, the Countess of Perche, his half-brother Richard, and scores of the most prominent young aristocrats of the Anglo-Norman world. Henry I, who received the news the following day, reportedly collapsed and did not speak for some time. He had lost his only legitimate male heir. Everything he had built, the consolidation of England and Normandy under a single crown, the careful construction of a dynasty intended to outlast him, was now threatened in the most fundamental way. What followed was a succession crisis that tore England apart for nearly 2 decades, the period known as the Anarchy, in which Henry's daughter Matilda and his nephew Stephen of Blois fought for the throne in a civil war whose violence and disruption left marks on English society that lasted long after the fighting ended. The sinking of the White Ship did not cause all of this, but it created the vacancy that made it possible. The single survivor, Barold, the butcher, is the beginning of the mystery that concerns us here. He was, by the nature of his survival, in possession of something no one else had: direct eyewitness knowledge of what happened aboard the White Ship in its final minutes, of who was where, of what was seen and heard as the vessel went down. His testimony was taken, used by contemporary chroniclers, and embedded in accounts that survive to the present day. But testimony is shaped by the conditions under which it is given, and Barold was a man of no social standing, giving an account of the deaths of the most powerful people in England to an audience with political stakes in how those deaths were understood. Whether his account was complete, whether it was accurate in all its particulars, and whether anything he knew was quietly set aside by those who received it. These are questions the surviving record does not answer cleanly. The claims that emerged in the decades following the White Ship disaster, and that have continued to surface with varying degrees of credibility in the centuries since, center on a specific and sensitive possibility. Contemporary accounts are unanimous that William Adelin drowned. But William Adelin was not the only royal or near-royal figure aboard the ship. and the question of whether everyone who was supposed to have died in the wreck actually did has been raised periodically by genealogists and historians working in the margins of the mainstream record. The white ship carried, in addition to the documented passengers, an indeterminate number of servants, attendants, and minor figures whose names were not all recorded by chroniclers primarily interested in the aristocratic dead. In the chaos of a ship sinking at night in cold water, with only one confirmed survivor, the establishment of who precisely died and who did not was necessarily incomplete. The bodies recovered from the waters off Barfleur in the days following the disaster were not all identified. Some were not recovered at all. This gap, between the list of those who were aboard and the list of those whose deaths were definitively confirmed, is where certain claims have taken root. The most persistent involve the question of illegitimate or unacknowledged children of figures who died on the white ship, whose existence would not have been recorded in official sources, and whose survival, if they had been aboard in an unofficial capacity, would similarly have gone undocumented. Henry I was famously prolific in his production of illegitimate children. 20 or more are usually attributed to him, making him one of the most documented producers of illegitimate royal offspring in English history. Whether any unacknowledged children of William Adelin or of other significant figures aboard the ship were present on the voyage, survived, and subsequently gave rise to lineages that later claimants would assert, this is a question that genealogical research has pursued with considerable energy and inconclusive results. The claims themselves tend to surface at moments of dynastic tension, periods when the question of legitimate descent from Anglo-Norman royal or noble lines had practical political implications. During the anarchy itself, when the question of who had the better claim to the English throne was literally being settled by armed conflict, assertions of descent from figures connected to the White Ship disaster had obvious utility. In the reigns that followed, as the Plantagenet dynasty consolidated its position, and the Anglo-Norman aristocracy was gradually absorbed into a broader English noble class, the specific claims diminished in political urgency, but did not disappear entirely. They reappear in genealogical manuscripts of the 13th and 14th centuries, documents that are themselves products of particular political contexts and whose reliability as records of actual descent is difficult to assess. Medieval genealogy was a practice that combined genuine record-keeping with strategic construction, and the two are not always easy to distinguish in surviving documents. A claim of descent from a figure lost on the White Ship, appearing in a 13th century manuscript compiled for a family with reasons to establish ancient Norman lineage, may represent an accurate oral tradition preserved across several generations. Or it may represent exactly the kind of manufactured ancestry that medieval genealogists were well practiced at providing. Modern genealogical and genetic research has brought new tools to some of these questions, though the application to White Ship claims specifically has been limited. DNA analysis has been used to examine questions of royal and aristocratic descent in medieval England, with results that have, in several cases, overturned assumptions that had survived centuries of documentary genealogy. The possibility of applying similar methods to the specific question of White Ship descent claims is real, though the practical obstacles, identifying suitable descendants, accessing relevant remains for comparison, establishing the chain of custody for the genetic evidence, are considerable. What the documentary record does preserve, with more reliability than the descent claims themselves, is the pattern of how those claims were used. In the immediate aftermath of the disaster, the question of who had survived and who had not was politically urgent in the most immediate sense. It determined who inherited titles, estates, and the complex web of feudal obligations that the Anglo-Norman world ran on. The speed with which that question was settled, and the interests that shaped how it was settled, were not neutral. Henry I's response to the disaster was to attempt, unsuccessfully, to produce a new legitimate male heir through his second marriage. When that failed, he designated his daughter Matilda as his successor, a designation that Stephen of Blois immediately contested on her father's death in 1135. The White Ship disaster had, in a period of approximately 15 years, transformed the English succession from a settled question into the most violently contested political issue in the kingdom. everything that followed. The anarchy, the compromise that eventually ended it, the Plantagenet dynasty that emerged from Matilda's son Henry II, flows from that November night off Barfleur. Beryl the butcher woke up on a cold Norman beach with the knowledge of what he had seen. He gave his testimony. The chronicles absorbed it. The claims multiplied in its wake. And somewhere in the gap between what the white ship actually carried into those dark waters and what the surviving record says it carried, there may be a lineage, a thread of descent from the most consequential shipwreck in medieval English history that has not yet been fully traced. Or perhaps the water off Barfleur was as complete in its work as it appeared to be, and the claims are simply what they so often are. The human desire to be connected to significant events, dressed in the language of genealogy and given the weight of historical ambition. The rock that sank the white ship is still there. The water above it still moves. What passed beneath it that night, and what survived it, may be the kind of question that only the sea knows the answer to. The sea off Barfleur took what it took and left one witness to account for it. The claims that followed were built on that single survival, that one thread of testimony stretched thin across generations until it frayed into something between genealogy and speculation. But there are other deaths, deaths that happen not in dark water, but in daylight, in an ordinary house, at the bottom of an ordinary staircase, where the witnesses were numerous and the testimony was clear, and somehow, despite all of that, the question of what actually happened has never been satisfactorily resolved. Cumnor Place no longer exists. The Elizabethan manor house in Oxfordshire was demolished in the 18th century, its stones dispersed and repurposed, the site absorbed into the Berkshire countryside with the thoroughness that English landscapes apply to structures that have outlived their usefulness. What stood there in September of 1560 was a comfortable secondary residence, owned by Anthony Forster, a man connected to the household of Robert Dudley, the man who was, at that precise moment in English history, the most talked-about person in the kingdom for reasons that had everything to do with the woman who was found dead at the bottom of its staircase on the 8th of September, 1560. Amy Robsart was 28 years old. She was the wife of Robert Dudley, Master of the Horse to Queen Elizabeth I, and the Queen's relationship with Dudley had been generating commentary, speculation, and alarm among the English court and foreign ambassadors for the better part of 2 years. The word used in some dispatches was love. The word used in others was scandal. The Spanish ambassador had reported to Philip II that Dudley intended to marry the Queen, and had added, with the careful phrasing of a professional diplomat who understood the implications of what he was writing, that the only obstacle was Dudley's wife, who was said to be ill. Amy Robsart was, by several contemporary accounts, suffering from some form of illness, described variously as a malady of the breast, which modern scholars have cautiously interpreted as possibly indicating breast cancer. She had been living largely apart from her husband for some time, staying at various houses while Dudley attended the Queen at court. On the 8th of September 1560, she was found dead at the foot of the staircase at Cumnor Place, her neck broken, her hood, a formal headdress, still carefully arranged on her head. The household had been sent to a local fair that day. Amy had apparently insisted on this, telling her attendants to leave despite at least one of them expressing reluctance to go. Why she had cleared the house is not known. What she was doing on the staircase is not known. Whether she fell, was pushed, or jumped is the question that has been debated for 460 years without resolution. A coroner's jury was convened almost immediately. They examined the scene, heard testimony from the household, and returned a verdict of accidental death. The physical evidence, as the jury assessed it, was consistent with a fall. The broken neck, the position of the body, the staircase itself. No verdict of foul play was returned. The official record from the moment of its creation said accident. The official record was not believed, not then, and not since. The reasons for disbelief were not merely circumstantial, though the circumstances were arresting enough. Robert Dudley's position at court, His relationship with the Queen, the reports that had been circulating about his intentions, the convenient timing of his wife's death at the precise moment when her existence was the primary obstacle to his ambitions. All of this was immediately noted by contemporaries who were not inclined to take the coroner's verdict at face value. Within days of Amy's death, the gossip had spread beyond England's borders. The Scottish diplomat William Maitland of Lethington reported the story with barely concealed alarm. The Spanish ambassador revised his earlier dispatches in ways that reflected the new situation. Cecil, Elizabeth's chief minister, and a man who had watched the Dudley situation with increasing anxiety, reportedly told the Spanish ambassador that the Queen's marriage to Dudley would be the ruin of her. A statement that reflected not only political calculation, but something that sounds very much like genuine fear about what Dudley might be capable of. Dudley himself was at court when Amy died. He had not been at Cumnor Place. This was noted by those who wished to establish that he could not have physically committed the act himself. But it was also noted by those who observed that a man who wished his wife dead did not necessarily need to be present to arrange it. The question of who, if anyone, might have acted on Dudley's behalf has been examined at length by historians working with the available documentary record. Anthony Forster, whose house it was and whose connection to Dudley was close, has been named. Sir Richard Verney, who was connected to Dudley's household and was reportedly present in the area, has been named. Neither accusation rests on evidence that meets any modern evidentiary standard. The mainstream scholarly position today tends toward one of two explanations. The first is accident. That Amy, possibly weakened by illness, possibly in some degree of physical or emotional distress, fell down the staircase and broke her neck, and that the absence of witnesses and the politically explosive context of the death generated suspicion that the physical evidence did not actually support. The second mainstream explanation is suicide, a possibility that has been argued most extensively by the historian Ian Aird, and more recently, by others working from the medical evidence. If Amy was suffering from advanced breast cancer, the disease could have caused metastatic spread to the bones of her spine, weakening the vertebrae to the degree that a relatively minor fall or even a spontaneous movement could cause the kind of fracture that killed her. The clearing of the house, in this reading, was an act of deliberate isolation. A woman who intended to die and arranged the conditions for it. The carefully placed hood, the insistence on solitude, the choice of a day when the household would be absent. These details, which in a murder scenario suggest staging, in a suicide scenario suggest preparation. The suicide hypothesis has the advantage of explaining the physical evidence without requiring a conspiracy. It has the disadvantage of being impossible to prove and of relying on medical inferences about a condition that was not formally diagnosed in surviving documents. Then there are the threads that neither mainstream explanation fully accounts for. The staircase at Cumnor Place was not a particularly dangerous one by the standards of the period. Contemporary accounts describe it as having only a few steps, shallow enough that a fall might be expected to injure rather than kill. The severity of Amy's injuries relative to the height of the fall has troubled analysts who have examined the case with forensic attention. A broken neck from a staircase of that height is not impossible, but it is not the automatic result one might expect, and the question of whether the injuries were consistent with the fall or suggested something more forceful applied to her has never been definitively resolved, partly because no forensic examination of the kind that might settle the question was ever possible. There is also the matter of the hood. Found neatly arranged on Amy's head after a fall violent enough to break her neck, this detail has been seized upon by those who argue for foul play as evidence of staging after the fact, of someone arranging the scene to present a particular appearance. It has been explained by others as evidence of the hood's construction, which may have been secure enough to survive the fall intact. The hood cannot be examined. It no longer exists. Elizabeth's reaction to Amy's death was complex in ways that do not resolve neatly into either innocence or guilt. She appeared genuinely shaken by the news. She immediately distanced herself from Dudley, sending him from court while the investigation proceeded. She never married him, a choice that has been interpreted as evidence that she knew or suspected something that made marriage to him impossible, and equally as evidence that Amy's death had made marriage to Dudley politically toxic, regardless of what Elizabeth personally believed about his involvement. Dudley lived for another 28 years, remaining in royal favor, though never again at the heights he had occupied in those early years of Elizabeth's reign. He married twice more. He was never formally accused. He was never formally cleared. The coroner's jury that returned its verdict in September of 1560 was composed of local men without particular political investment in the outcome, and their finding of accidental death deserves to be taken seriously as a considered judgment by people who saw the physical evidence directly. It is also true that they were local men, operating in a political environment of extraordinary sensitivity, returning a verdict about a death connected to the most powerful man in England and the Queen herself. Whether they found what the evidence showed them, or found what the situation required them to find, is a question that the record preserves without answering. Amy Robsart was found at the bottom of a staircase in an empty house, on a day when everyone had been sent away, with her neck broken and her hood in place. 4 centuries of inquiry have not improved significantly on that description. The staircase is gone. The house is gone. And the truth of what happened on that September afternoon, accident, illness, suicide, murder, remains exactly where it was found. At the bottom of the stairs, waiting for someone to look more closely than the evidence allows, Amy Robsart died at the bottom of a staircase in an empty house, and the truth of what happened there has proven as resistant to recovery as anything hidden in deep water. Some mysteries are like that, contained, precise, anchored to a specific place and moment, and yet impenetrable despite their smallness. But we have returned, throughout this exploration, to the sea. And the sea offers its own particular variety of impenetrability. Not the smallness of a single staircase in an Oxfordshire manor, but the vastness of ocean distances, the silence of water that stretches to the horizon in every direction, and the particular way that the early 16th century disposed of men and ships in waters that had no established rescue infrastructure, no communication networks, and no institutional memory capable of preserving what was lost. Jean Parmentier deserves to be better known than he is. That he is not, that his name requires introduction even to reasonably well-informed readers of maritime history, is itself part of the story, and connects to the broader pattern of French exploration in the Age of Discovery being systematically underrepresented in the popular historical record that has been shaped largely by the priorities of Iberian, English, and Dutch chroniclers. The French were there. They were active, capable, and in certain respects ahead of their time. And what happened to their expeditions has often been absorbed into the general category of Age of Exploration loss, without the specific attention that the individual cases deserve. Parmentier was born in Dieppe, in Normandy, sometime around 1494. Dieppe in the early 16th century was one of the most important maritime centers in France, a port city with a tradition of navigation and cartography that rivaled anything in Lisbon or Seville, and a community of sailors and merchants who had been conducting Atlantic and Indian Ocean voyages with a consistency and ambition that the surviving documentary record, heavily skewed toward Iberian sources, has tended to underreport. The Norman sailors of Dieppe operated within networks that were partly commercial, partly royal, and partly the product of individual initiative in a period when the boundaries between those categories were considerably more permeable than they would later become. By the 1520s, Parmentier had established himself as a navigator of exceptional ability. Not simply a sailor, but a man of genuine intellectual formation, a poet and humanist as well as a seaman, who moved with apparent ease between the practical world of ocean navigation and the literary and scholarly culture that was reshaping European intellectual life in the wake of the Renaissance. He was, in the terminology that his era would have recognized, a complete man, someone for whom the navigation of actual oceans and the navigation of ideas were not separate activities, but aspects of a single engagement with the world. He made multiple successful voyages to Brazil and other Atlantic destinations before the expedition that would define and end his career. In 1529, backed by a consortium of Dieppe merchants and operating with at least the tacit support of the French crown, Parmentier commanded 2 ships, the Sacre and the Pensée, on a voyage to the Indian Ocean. This was extraordinary. The Indian Ocean trade routes had been, since Vasco da Gama's breakthrough voyage of 1498, effectively the operational domain of Portugal, protected by a combination of papal treaty, Portuguese naval force, and the practical advantage of established infrastructure along the route. For a French expedition to attempt those waters was not merely commercially ambitious. It was a direct challenge to the Iberian monopoly on eastern trade that both Spain and Portugal regarded as a matter of divine right and national survival. Parmentier reached Sumatra. This achievement alone, navigating 2 French ships through the Cape of Good Hope, across the Indian Ocean, and to the Indonesian archipelago without the benefit of Portuguese charts, Portuguese infrastructure, or Portuguese permission, represents a feat of navigation that deserves considerably more recognition than it typically receives. He established contact with local rulers in Sumatra, traded successfully, and loaded his ships with the spices that were the entire point of the enterprise. And then he died. In December of 1529, while still in Sumatran waters, Parmentier succumbed to illness. The disease is not precisely identified in the surviving sources, but something contracted in the tropical environment of the Indonesian archipelago. He was approximately 35 years old. His brother Raoul, who had commanded the second ship, died within days of him. The expedition that survived was now leaderless, in waters far from home, without its 2 most experienced navigators. The remaining crew, their number already reduced by the ordinary attrition of a long ocean voyage, faced the return journey through the Indian Ocean, around Africa, and back to Dieppe without the men who had brought them there. What happened next is where the documentary record begins to thin in ways that raise questions beyond the straightforward tragedy of the Parmentier brothers' deaths. One ship, the accounts are not entirely consistent about which, did return to Dieppe, arriving in 1530 with a reduced crew and a cargo of spices that represented a commercial success, despite the human cost. The other ship's fate is considerably less clear. The surviving sources from Dieppe's merchant community reference the return of the expedition in ways that are imprecise about exactly what returned and in what condition, and the gap between what the 2 ships carried out and what came back has never been fully reconciled. The cargo question matters because it connects to the broader issue of what Parmentier's expedition actually achieved in commercial and geographic terms. The spices that returned to Dieppe were valuable enough to encourage subsequent French Indian Ocean ventures, but the full extent of what Parmentier had discovered, about routes, about trading relationships, about the geographic realities of the waters he had navigated, is preserved only partially in surviving documents. Parmentier was a writer as well as a navigator. He composed poetry and appears to have maintained records of his voyages that were more literary and reflective than the purely practical logs that most navigators kept. Whether those records survived the voyage, what happened to them after his death in Sumatran waters, and whether they were preserved anywhere in the Dieppe merchant community's archives, which were themselves subject to destruction across subsequent centuries of French religious conflict, is uncertain. The Dieppe school of cartography that flourished in the decades following Parmentier's death produced some of the most remarkable maps of the mid-16th century. Maps that show, among other things, features of the Australian and East Asian coastlines that have generated sustained scholarly debate about what French navigators might have seen that was not recorded in official sources. Some researchers have proposed that the Dieppe cartographers were working from navigational intelligence accumulated across multiple Indian Ocean voyages, including Parmentier's, that was never formalized into the kind of expedition reports that Portuguese and Spanish archives contain. Whether Parmentier's voyage contributed to that cartographic knowledge, whether the routes he navigated and the coastlines he observed fed into the Dieppe maps through channels that the surviving documents do not make explicit, is a question that connects his individual story to a larger puzzle about French geographic knowledge in the early 16th century. There is also the question of what Parmentier might have achieved if he had lived. The 1529 voyage demonstrated that the Indian Ocean was accessible to French navigation without Portuguese assistance or permission. A commander of Parmentier's ability, returning successfully from Sumatra, would have been in a position to organize and lead the kind of systematic French engagement with the eastern trade routes that might have altered the balance of the spice trade decades earlier than it eventually shifted. His death at 35 cut off a trajectory whose full length cannot be calculated, but which contemporary observers clearly recognized as significant. The French crown's response to the 1529 expedition was not the sustained program of follow-up voyages that its success might have justified. The political complexities of France's European situation, the ongoing struggle with the Habsburgs, the domestic pressures of the Reformation's early impacts on French society, the contested question of royal support for private merchant ventures, all conspired to delay a sustained French presence in the Indian Ocean by decades. Whether a living Parmentier, with the authority of a successful voyage behind him, could have accelerated that engagement is speculative. That his death removed the person most qualified to press the case is not. He was buried in Sumatra, in waters his countrymen would not regularly sail again for another generation. The exact location of his burial is not recorded in any surviving source. The ships that carried him there came back, or most of them did, with spices and reduced crews, and the navigational knowledge that a dead man could no longer personally transmit. What Parmentier saw on that voyage, what he understood about the eastern seas, what he might have written in the literary navigational records that he appears to have maintained, most of it went with him, absorbed into the tropical ground of an island thousands of miles from the Norman port where he was born. And the Dieppe maps, produced in the decades after his death by cartographers working from sources they did not always name, show coastlines that no surviving expedition account fully explains. Whether Parmentier's knowledge is somewhere in those maps, encoded in coastline and measurement and the particular confidence of lines drawn by people who knew rather than guessed, is a question the maps themselves cannot answer.